I wouldn't miss you. Those 4 words changed everything. When Daniel Cross stood alone on that frozen platform in 1885, waiting for a woman he'd never seen, he had no idea he was stepping into a love story that would test every promise he'd ever made. What started with letters would end in bloodshed, betrayal, and a fight for survival that would define their lives forever. This is the true story of a cowboy who kept his word and the woman who made him prove it. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The wind howled like the wounded animal across the Texas plains, carrying ice that cut like broken glass. Daniel Cross stood on the platform of the Abilene Depot, his hat pulled low, his coat collar turned up against the storm that had no business being in Texas. Not in March, not ever. His boots were planted firm on boards already slick with ice, and his breath came out in clouds that the wind tore apart before they could fully form. He'd been standing there for 3 hours. The station master had gone home 2 hours ago, shaking his head and muttering about fools and frozen corpses. The few other souls who'd been waiting had long since given up, retreating to the warmth of the hotel across the muddy street. But Daniel stayed. His hands were numb inside his gloves. His face felt like leather stretched too tight, and he couldn't feel his toes anymore. None of that mattered. He'd made a promise. The train was supposed to arrive at 2 o'clock. It was now past 5, and the light was dying fast, turning the world into shades of gray and white. The blizzard had swept down from the north like God's own fury, catching everyone by surprise. Cattle were freezing in the fields. Roofs were collapsing under the weight of snow that shouldn't exist. And somewhere out there in that white hell, a train was crawling toward Abilene, carrying a woman Daniel had never met face to face. Lillian Moore, school teacher from Boston, 26 years old, brown hair, blue eyes, or so she'd written. For 6 months, they'd exchanged letters. His words had been simple, honest, rough around the edges like everything else about him. Hers had been elegant, thoughtful, filled with observations about books he'd never read, and ideas that made him think long after he'd folded the paper and tucked it away. He hadn't meant to fall for her through ink and paper. Hell, he hadn't meant to fall for anyone. At 32, Daniel had made his peace with loneliness. The ranch took all his time, all his energy. The land was hard. The work was harder, and relationships were luxuries for men who had the patience for them. He'd tried once, years ago, with a girl from town. It had ended badly. She'd wanted society and comfort, and he'd had nothing but calloused hands and a half-built dream. But then his sister Clara had placed that damned advertisement in the Boston newspapers. Honest rancher seeks correspondence with educated woman. Friendship first, possibility of more. He'd been furious when he found out, had nearly torn the whole thing up. But Clara had looked at him with those knowing eyes and said, "Danny, you're going to die alone and stubborn if somebody doesn't kick you in the right direction." The first letter had arrived 3 weeks later. "Dear Mr. Cross, I hope this letter finds you well. My name is Lillian Moore, and I confess I am not entirely certain what compels me to respond to your sister's advertisement, except perhaps curiosity and a desire for something beyond the ordinary constraints of my current circumstances." Her handwriting had been perfect, each letter carefully formed. The words had been formal, distant, careful. But between the lines, he'd sensed something else, loneliness that matched his own, a yearning for something real in a world that felt increasingly artificial. He'd written back that same night, sitting at his kitchen table by lamplight, struggling to make his rough thoughts sound presentable on paper. He'd told her about the ranch, about the work, about the sky, so big it made you feel small and significant at the same time. He'd been honest about the hardships, about the isolation, about the fact that out here, pretty words didn't mean much if you couldn't back them up with action. She'd written back 2 weeks later. Then he'd replied. Then she had again. The letters had come faster, longer, more personal. She'd told him about her childhood, about losing her parents to fever, about the boarding school that had raised her and the teaching position she'd held for 4 years at a girls' academy. She told him about feeling trapped in a life of tea parties and propriety, about wanting something more substantial, more meaningful. "I wonder sometimes if I am foolish," she'd written in her 5th letter, "to imagine that a life built on honest work and open spaces might be more fulfilling than one built on social expectations and hollow courtesies. But then I think perhaps foolishness is simply another word for hope." He'd read that line a dozen times, feeling something shift in his chest. By the fourth month, they were writing weekly. By the fifth month, he was checking the mail every day, sometimes twice. Clara had noticed, of course, and she'd smiled that irritating, knowing smile, but had the grace not to say anything. And then in January, Lillian had written the letter that changed everything. Daniel, may I call you Daniel? Mr. Cross feels too formal now, after all we've shared. I have been offered a teaching position in San Francisco. The salary is excellent, the opportunity significant. I should accept without hesitation. And yet I find myself hesitating because accepting means closing a door that I'm not certain I want closed. You wrote once that you value honesty above all else, so here is my honest truth. I would like to meet you. Not as pen pals, not as distant correspondents, but as two people standing in the same room, seeing if the connection we've built through words can exist in the real world. If you're willing, I would come to Texas in March, before I must give my answer to San Francisco. If I'm being too forward, please forgive me and forget I ever suggested it. Daniel had sat in his kitchen for an hour after reading that letter, the words blurring as he read them again and again. Then he'd written back with shaking hands. Lillian, yes, you can call me Daniel. Please come. I'll be waiting at the Abilene Depot on March 15th, 2 o'clock train. Whatever happens after that, we'll figure out together. He'd posted the letter the next morning and had spent the following 6 weeks working himself nearly to death, fixing up the spare room in his house, repairing fences, cleaning years of bachelor neglect from corners he'd ignored. Clara had helped, bringing curtains and suggestions, her excitement barely contained. You're terrified, she'd said one afternoon, finding him standing motionless in the doorway of the spare room, paintbrush in hand. No, I'm not. You absolutely are. You're terrified she'll take one look at you and get back on the train. He'd wanted to deny it, but the words had stuck in his throat because she was right. He was terrified. Not of the work, not of the commitment, not even of the possibility of rejection. He was terrified that the man Lillian knew from letters, thoughtful, articulate, capable of expressing feelings on paper that he could barely admit to himself, was someone who didn't exist in real life. But he'd made a promise. He told her he'd be waiting. So here he stood, 3 hours into a blizzard that had shut down the whole territory, waiting for a train that might not come, and a woman who might not want him when she saw him. The wind shifted, and Daniel thought he heard something, a distant whistle, barely audible over the storm. He straightened, straining to hear it again. There. Faint, but unmistakable. The train. His heart began to pound harder than it had any right to. He stepped to the edge of the platform, peering into the white wall of snow that had swallowed the world. For long minutes, he saw nothing. Then, slowly, like a ghost materializing from fog, the dark shape of the locomotive emerged from the blizzard. The train was crawling, moving at perhaps 5 miles an hour, its bell clanging mournfully. Ice clung to every surface, and steam rose from the engine in great billowing clouds that the wind immediately shredded. The brakes screamed as the train ground to a halt, shuddering along its entire length. Daniel walked forward, his boots crunching through 2 inches of fresh snow. He positioned himself opposite the passenger car, watching as the conductor emerged, looking exhausted and half-frozen. "Worst damn trip of my life," the conductor muttered, not really speaking to Daniel. "Thought we'd have to stop and wait it out, but the company insisted. 3 hours behind schedule, and we're lucky it's only 3. Daniel barely heard him. He was watching the passenger car door, his throat tight, his hands clenched inside his gloves. The door opened and an elderly couple emerged, moving slowly, carefully, helped down by the conductor. Then a businessman muttering curses about the weather. Then 2 more passengers. Then her. She appeared in the doorway, and Daniel's breath caught. She was smaller than he'd imagined, more delicate, wearing a dark blue traveling dress and a coat that looked far too thin for this weather. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as she took in the storm, and even from 20 feet away he could see she was shivering. Their eyes met. For a moment, the world narrowed to just that, her eyes finding his across the platform, through the snow, across all the distance that separated them. He saw surprise flash across her face, then something else. Relief, maybe. Or recognition. He wasn't sure. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The conductor was helping her down, and she was moving carefully, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding a small case. When her feet touched the platform, she looked up at him again, and he saw that her lips were almost blue with cold. "Miss Moore?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by the cold and 3 hours of silence. "Mr. Cross?" Her voice was soft, almost musical, exactly as he'd imagined it. You're here." "I said I would be." She stared at him, and he couldn't read her expression. Shock? Disappointment? He suddenly felt every rough edge of himself, the scar on his jaw from a horse's kick, the hands too calloused to touch anything gentle, the eyes that had seen too much hardness to be truly kind. "The storm," she said quietly. "I thought, when we were delayed, when it got worse, I thought surely no one would be waiting. I thought I'd arrive to an empty platform. I made a promise." He reached for her case, and she let him take it. "Come on. We need to get you warm before you freeze to death." He turned toward the street, expecting her to follow, but she didn't move. He looked back, and she was still standing there in the snow, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "You waited," she said. 3 hours in a blizzard." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. Why? Because he'd said he would. Because a promise was a promise. Because the thought of her arriving alone, scared in this storm, to a town she'd never seen, with no one to meet her, that thought had been unbearable. "Because I wouldn't miss you," he said finally. The words came out wrong, but he couldn't figure out how to fix them. "Miss meeting you, I mean. Wouldn't miss that. Not for anything." Something changed in her expression then. The wariness softened, and she smiled, small, uncertain, but real. "You're exactly as I imagined," she said softly, "and nothing like I imagined at all." Before he could figure out what that meant, she stepped forward, fell into step beside him, and they walked together into the storm. The hotel was called the Cattleman's Rest, which was a generous name for what was essentially a 2-story wooden building with rooms above a saloon. But it was warm, and right now, that was all that mattered. Daniel got Lillian inside, secured her a room, the best one available, which wasn't saying much, and arranged for hot water to be brought up for washing. "I'll give you time to settle in," he said, standing awkwardly in the narrow hallway outside her room. "There's a dining room downstairs. Not fancy, but the food's decent. I can meet you there in an hour, if you're not too tired." She was standing in the doorway of her room, looking more fragile than her letters had suggested, her hands still shaking slightly from the cold. But her eyes were sharp, taking in everything, the worn carpet, the peeling wallpaper, the sounds of rough laughter drifting up from the saloon below. "An hour would be fine," she said. Then, hesitantly, "Daniel?" He stopped, turned back. "Yes, ma'am?" "Thank you for waiting, for all of this." He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, and headed downstairs. The saloon was busy despite the storm, or maybe because of it. Men who'd been caught in town when the blizzard hit were making the most of it, drinking and playing cards and telling lies about how much worse storms they'd survived. Daniel found a table in the corner of the attached dining room, away from the noise, and ordered coffee. His hands were finally starting to thaw, painful pinpricks of sensation returning to his fingers. He flexed them, staring at the dark surface of the coffee, trying to organize his thoughts. She was real. After 6 months of letters, of imagination, of wondering, she was real, sitting upstairs in a room above his head, probably wondering what the hell she'd gotten herself into. And God, she was beautiful. Not in the flashy way some women were, not in the way that made men stupid, but in a quiet way that made you want to look longer, made you notice the curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell when it escaped her pins, the intelligence in her eyes. He'd seen the moment she looked at him, though, seen her take in the rough clothes, the weathered face, the hands that had never held anything more delicate than a rope. He'd seen her adjust her expectations downward, seen her realize that the man who wrote those letters was still just a cowboy who smelled like horses and dirt. "Well, hell, Danny Cross, that really you under all that ice?" Daniel looked up to find Tom Reynolds standing over his table, grinning. Tom was a fellow rancher, owned land about 10 miles south of Daniel's property. They weren't close friends, but they'd worked together enough times to have mutual respect. Tom, heard you were standing out there like a damn fool, waiting for the train in this mess. Thought you'd frozen solid by now. Tom pulled out a chair without being invited and sat down. What's so important? It couldn't wait for decent weather. Daniel hesitated, not sure how much he wanted to share, but Tom would find out anyway. It was a small town, and secrets didn't keep long. Friend coming in from back east, he said carefully, made arrangements to meet the 2 o'clock. Tom's eyebrows went up. Friend, huh? The kind of friend that makes a man stand in a blizzard? Before Daniel could answer, the stairs creaked, and he looked up to see Lillian descending into the dining room. She'd changed into a fresh dress, dark green this time, and her hair was pinned back neatly. Her color was better, though she still looked tired from the journey. Every conversation in the room died. It wasn't just that she was pretty. Beautiful women came through Abilene sometimes, heading to San Francisco or Denver. But there was something about Lillian that commanded attention. The way she held herself, the dignity in her bearing, the sense that she was completely out of place and yet somehow entirely composed. She saw Daniel and moved toward him, navigating between tables with careful grace. Daniel stood, pulling out a chair for her. Miss Moore, this is Tom Reynolds. His ranch borders mine to the south. Tom, this is Miss Lillian Moore from Boston. Tom stood, swept off his hat, and actually bowed slightly. Daniel had never seen him do that before. Ma'am, pleasure to meet you. Welcome to Texas. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Her voice was warm but reserved, polite in that way Eastern people were polite. Friendly on the surface, careful underneath. I apologize for arriving during such dramatic weather. I promise I didn't bring it with me. Tom laughed, a bit too loud. No, ma'am, this is all Texas is doing. Though I got to say, if you're used to Boston winters, this probably doesn't seem like much. Oh, Boston has snow, Lillian said, settling into her chair as Daniel pushed it in. But this wind, it's different, more persistent somehow. It feels like it goes right through everything. That's Texas for you. The wind don't know when to quit. Tom was still standing there, hat in hand, clearly reluctant to leave. You visiting long, Miss Moore? Daniel tensed, waiting for Lillian's answer. They hadn't discussed what she would tell people, how they would explain her presence. I'm considering a teaching position in the area, Lillian said smoothly. Mr. Cross was kind enough to offer to show me around, help me get a sense of the community. It was perfect, true enough to not be a lie, vague enough to not be binding. Daniel felt a flash of admiration for how quickly she'd navigated the question. Well, we could sure use a good teacher, Tom said. The school we got now is barely holding together, and Miss Patterson, who runs it, is about 100 years old and meaner than a snake. If you're half as educated as you sound, you'd be doing this town a favor. That's very kind of you to say. Tom finally took the hint and backed away, though Daniel noticed he kept glancing back at their table as he returned to his friends at the bar. Within minutes, Daniel could see the whispers starting, the curious looks. By morning, the whole town would know he'd been waiting in a blizzard for a beautiful woman from Boston. Let them talk. He had bigger concerns. Are you hungry? He asked Lillian. The steak here is decent, and they do a good stew. Stew sounds wonderful. She folded her hands on the table, and he noticed they were red from the cold, probably chapped. Though I confess I'm so tired I might fall asleep in it. The train was that bad? The train was an adventure. She smiled slightly, but he could see the exhaustion behind it. We stopped 4 times for the crew to clear snow from the tracks. The car was freezing. The heating stove couldn't keep up. And somewhere in Oklahoma we passed another train that had derailed. No one was hurt, thank God, but it was sobering to see. Daniel signaled the waitress, ordered stew and bread for both of them. When she was gone, he leaned back in his chair, studying Lillian's face. She was doing the same to him, he realized, both of them trying to reconcile the person in front of them with the person they'd imagined. You're surprised I waited, he said finally. She blinked, taken aback by his directness. Yes, I suppose I am. Why? Because it would have been reasonable not to, because the storm was dangerous, and you had no way of knowing if I'd even be on that train. Because, She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because, in my experience, men say many things in letters that they don't follow through on in person. There was a story there, Daniel thought. A hurt somewhere in her past, a disappointment that had taught her to keep her expectations low. He filed it away, something to understand later. I'm not much for pretty words, he said. Never have been. But when I say something, I mean it. When I make a promise, I keep it. That's not nobility or virtue. It's just how I was raised. She studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes searching his face. I believe you, she said softly, though I'm not sure I should, having just met you. But I do. The stew arrived, steaming and rich, and they ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Daniel watched as Lillian took her first bite, saw the surprise flash across her face. This is excellent, she said. Told you. Sal's been cooking here for 20 years. Nothing fancy, but he knows what he's doing. They ate, and gradually the exhaustion seemed to lift from Lillian's shoulders. Color returned to her cheeks. She asked him about the town, about the land, about the ranch. He answered honestly, not trying to make it sound better than it was, but not underselling it either. It's hard work, he said. Sun up to sundown, most days. And the land doesn't forgive mistakes. You can do everything right and still lose everything to drought or disease or just bad luck. But when it works, when you see something you built with your own hands thriving, there's nothing else like it. That's what I want, Lillian said, so quietly he almost missed it. Something real, something that matters. I'm tired of... She stopped herself, shook her head. I'm sorry. That's not fair to you, burdening you with my dissatisfactions on our first meeting. It's not a burden. And we're not strangers, Lillian. We've been writing each other for 6 months. I know about your parents, about the boarding school, about that headmistress who told you women shouldn't waste time with mathematics. You know about my father drinking himself to death, about Clara raising me after our mother died, about that time I nearly lost the ranch in the drought of '82. We've shared things that matter. This, he gestured between them, this is just figuring out if what we built in letters can exist when we're in the same room. She looked at him with something like wonder. You really are exactly as I imagined, she said again. Direct, honest. Maybe too honest for polite society. Polite society doesn't have much use for men like me. No, she agreed, but perhaps women like me do. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and risk. Daniel felt his heart beat harder, felt the moment stretch and transform into something significant. But before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the saloon. Raised voices, the crash of furniture, then a gunshot that made everyone in the dining room freeze. Daniel was on his feet instantly, his hand going automatically to his hip where his gun usually sat. But he'd left it at home, not wanting to appear armed when meeting Lillian. He cursed silently, moving toward the doorway to see what was happening. In the saloon, 2 men were facing off near the bar. One was a local rancher named Pete Morrison, drunk and swaying. The other was a stranger, dressed too well for Abilene, with a fancy vest and a gun still raised toward the ceiling where he'd fired the warning shot. I said the cards were marked, the stranger was saying, his voice cold and controlled despite the alcohol Daniel could smell from 10 feet away. I don't lose to marked cards. The cards ain't marked. You're just a sore loser, Pete shouted back, his own gun halfway out of his holster. This was about to go very bad, very fast. Daniel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. Pete, put the gun down. Whatever this is, it's not worth dying over. Pete's eyes flicked to Daniel, and some of the rage drained from his face. Pete respected Daniel, had worked for him during the drought years when Pete's own ranch was failing. Danny, this son of a bitch is calling me a cheat. I don't care if he called you the Queen of England. Put the gun down. For a tense moment, Pete wavered. Then, slowly, he let his hand drop away from his holster. The stranger, however, kept his gun up, now pointed at Pete's chest. His eyes were cold, calculating. Just because your friend here says to back down doesn't mean I do. Daniel felt the temperature in the room drop. This wasn't a drunk man looking for a fight. This was something more dangerous. A man who wanted to hurt someone, who was looking for an excuse. You fired the warning shot. Daniel said carefully, stepping slightly to the side, making the stranger divide his attention. You made your point. Now everybody backs down, and we all sleep better tonight. The stranger's eyes moved to Daniel, assessing him. And who exactly are you to tell me what to do? Nobody important, just a man tired of seeing good people die over cards and whiskey. Noble. The word dripped with sarcasm. But I don't see why I should care about your fatigue. Daniel could see it in the man's eyes. He was going to shoot. Pete saw it too, his hand moving back toward his gun. In seconds, men would die, and there was nothing Daniel could do without a weapon of his own. Then Lillian's voice cut through the room, clear and commanding in a way Daniel had never heard before. Gentlemen, I believe you're frightening me. Every head turned toward her. She'd stood up from their table and moved to the doorway of the dining room, one hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide. She looked terrified, fragile, every inch the delicate Eastern lady confronted with Western violence. But Daniel saw the calculation in her eyes, saw the way she'd positioned herself where the stranger would have to turn his back on Pete to look at her fully. She was creating an opening. Ma'am, you should go upstairs, the stranger said, but his gun had lowered slightly, his attention divided. I would, but I'm afraid I might faint, and these stairs are so steep. Her voice wavered convincingly. Perhaps someone could help me. It was brilliant. No man, no matter how violent, wanted to be responsible for a woman fainting in fear because of his actions. The stranger's face tightened with irritation, but he lowered his gun fully, sliding it back into his holster. Fine. Everyone calm down. The lady's scared. He threw some bills on the bar. Keep the winnings. I'm done with this town anyway. He pushed past Daniel, heading for the stairs to his own room. As he passed Lillian, he paused, tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. My apologies for distressing you, ma'am. Thank you for your understanding, Lillian said, her voice still trembling perfectly. The stranger disappeared up the stairs. The moment he was gone, the tension shattered like glass. Pete sank onto a bar stool, shaking. The other patrons began talking again, nervous laughter filling the space where violence had been. Daniel walked over to Lillian, who was still standing in the doorway, her hand still pressed to her chest. But when she looked up at him, there was no fear in her eyes, only sharp intelligence and a hint of satisfaction. That was the bravest damn thing I've ever seen, he said quietly. That was the stupidest damn thing I've ever done, she corrected. But I couldn't just stand there and watch people die. Where did you learn to do that? 4 years teaching at a girls' academy, she said dryly. You'd be amazed what you learn about managing dangerous situations when you're responsible for 60 adolescent girls, though I confess none of them were armed. Despite everything, Daniel laughed. It came out rough, relieved, and he saw answering amusement flash in Lillian's eyes. Come on, he said, offering his arm. Let's get you back to your room before anything else exciting happens. She took his arm, and they climbed the stairs together. When they reached her door, she paused, her hand on the knob. Daniel? Yeah? In your letters, you wrote that out here. Pretty words don't mean much if you can't back them up with action. You said character is proven in how people act when things are difficult. She looked up at him, and in the dim light of the hallway, her eyes seemed very blue. Tonight, I saw your character. Standing in a blizzard, keeping your word. Stepping into danger without a weapon because someone needed to. I just wanted you to know that. Before he could respond, she'd slipped inside her room, closing the door quietly behind her. Daniel stood in the hallway for a long moment, his heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the near violence downstairs. Then he headed to his own room, knowing that sleep would be impossible, knowing that everything had just changed in ways he couldn't fully understand yet. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, burying Texas under snow that shouldn't exist. But inside, something warm had sparked to life, something that all the storms in the world couldn't extinguish. Tomorrow, they would begin to figure out what they meant to each other. Tonight, they both lay in their separate rooms, thinking about promises kept and risks taken and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that the connection built through letters might be only the beginning of something much deeper. The train had arrived in a blizzard. The cowboy had been waiting. He'd said those 4 words that would echo through everything that followed. I wouldn't miss you. And in that moment, everything had changed. Morning came reluctantly, the sun hidden behind clouds that still threatened snow. Daniel woke before dawn as he always did, his body refusing to acknowledge that he wasn't at the ranch with work waiting. He dressed in the dim light, splashed cold water on his face from the basin, and headed downstairs before the dining room officially opened. Sal was already in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. The old cook looked up when Daniel appeared and grunted something that might have been a greeting. "Early riser or couldn't sleep?" Sal asked, pouring coffee without being asked. "Habit?" "Uh-huh." Sal slapped bacon onto a plate with eggs and fried potatoes. "Heard about last night?" "Both parts." "You standing in that storm like a fool, and you stepping between Pete and that card sharp." Daniel wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, letting the heat seep into his palms. "News travels fast. This is Abilene. News travels before it even happens." Sal set the plate down with a thud. "That woman you're with, she's quality, real quality. Not the kind that usually ends up in a place like this." "I know. You planning on doing right by her?" Daniel looked up sharply. Sal met his gaze steadily, no judgment in his weathered face, just honest curiosity. "I'm planning on giving her the choice," Daniel said carefully. "That's all any man can do." Sal nodded slowly, seeming satisfied with that answer. "Fair enough, just don't mess it up. Women like that don't come along twice." Daniel was finishing his breakfast when Lillian appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She wore a simple gray dress with a white collar, her hair pinned back in a way that was practical rather than decorative. She looked tired but composed, and when she saw him, something eased in her expression. "Good morning," she said, crossing to his table. "I hope I didn't oversleep. I wasn't sure what time would be appropriate." "No such thing as oversleep after the day you had yesterday." Daniel stood, pulled out a chair for her. "Coffee?" "Please. Strong, if possible." He signaled Sal, who appeared with coffee and a knowing look that Daniel chose to ignore. Lillian wrapped her hands around the mug the same way Daniel had, and he noticed the gesture, how they both sought warmth in the same way. "How did you sleep?" he asked. "Better than I expected, given everything." She took a sip of coffee, closed her eyes briefly in appreciation. "Though I had some interesting dreams about blizzards and gunfights." "I'm sorry about that. Last night, that's not typical. Most days around here are pretty quiet." "I'm not complaining. It was educational." She smiled slightly. "I learned that Western hospitality includes both waiting in storms and preventing murders. Quite comprehensive." He found himself smiling back. "We aim to impress." They ate breakfast together, falling into an easy conversation that felt like a continuation of their letters. She asked him about the ranch, about the work that would be waiting when he returned. He asked her about Boston, about the teaching position in San Francisco she'd been offered. "It's a prestigious academy," she said, spreading jam on toast with careful precision. "The salary is nearly double what I make now. The headmistress is progressive. She believes in educating girls in mathematics and sciences, not just art and deportment. By every logical measure, I should accept." "But you haven't." "No." She set down her knife, looked at him directly. "Because accepting means admitting that this, whatever this is between us, isn't worth exploring. And I'm not ready to admit that yet." The honesty of it struck him silent for a moment. In her letters, Lillian had been open, but there had still been a layer of protection, the safety of distance. Here, now, across a breakfast table in a rough Western hotel, she was offering him truth without armor. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "I know this isn't easy, coming all this way for something uncertain." "Nothing worth having is certain at the beginning," she said. "That's what makes it worth having." Outside, the storm had finally broken. The sky was still gray, but the wind had died down, and the temperature had risen enough that the snow was beginning to melt, turning the streets into muddy rivers. Daniel paid for breakfast, and they stepped outside into air that felt almost warm after yesterday's brutal cold. "I thought we could walk through town," Daniel said. "Let you get a sense of the place. Then, if you're not too tired, we could ride out to the ranch. It's about an hour by horse. Clara's there. She's been dying to meet you." Lillian looked down at her dress, then at the mud. I may have brought the wrong wardrobe for Texas. I can arrange for a different... He stopped himself. Actually, Clara probably has something you could borrow. She's close to your size, and she's got riding clothes that would work better than what you've got. That's very kind. Are you sure she won't mind? She'll be thrilled. Fair warning, though. Clara's going to ask you 100 questions. She has no concept of privacy or boundaries. She sounds wonderful. They began walking down the main street, Daniel pointing out the various establishments. The general store, run by a German immigrant named Friedrich, who spoke better English than most natives but refused to admit it. The church, which held services every Sunday and social gatherings most Wednesday nights. The school, a small building that did indeed look like it was barely holding together, where Miss Patterson ruled with what one of Daniel's neighbors had once called an iron fist and a tongue like razor wire. The children are terrified of her, Daniel said. But they learn. Say what you want about her methods, but kids who go through her school can read and cipher better than most adults I know. Lillian studied the building thoughtfully. Fear is an effective motivator for learning facts, but it kills curiosity, and curiosity is what makes education meaningful. A child who's afraid to ask questions will never love learning. Is that how you teach? I try to. She paused, seemed to gather her thoughts. I believe children are capable of far more than most adults give them credit for. They can handle difficult concepts, wrestle with complex ideas, if you present it in a way that respects their intelligence. But you have to create an environment where it's safe to be wrong, where mistakes are part of learning rather than something to be punished. Daniel listened, fascinated by the passion in her voice. This was what she'd written about in her letters. This belief in education is something transformative rather than just practical. The academy in Boston, where I teach, she continued, they wanted me to focus on deportment and manners. Make sure the girls could host tea parties and make pleasant conversation. And those skills matter, I suppose, but she gestured helplessly. These are brilliant young women with minds that could do remarkable things, and we're teaching them to smile and curtsy. That's why you're considering San Francisco. That was why. But then I started writing to you, and I began to wonder if maybe what I really want isn't another prestigious academy in another city. Maybe what I want is... She stopped walking, turned to face him. Can I be honest? Always. When I read your letters, when you describe this place, the work, the challenges, I kept thinking about how much good a real school could do here. Not just teaching children to read and cipher, but giving them tools to think, to question, to become more than what they're expected to be. A frontier town needs that maybe more than a city full of established academies. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't expected to feel. You're thinking about staying. I'm thinking about the possibility. She looked away, suddenly seeming uncertain. I'm getting ahead of myself. We've only just met in person. You might find after a few days that you can't stand me. I don't think that's likely. You don't know me yet. Not really. I know you faced down an armed man last night to save a stranger. I know you traveled 2,000 miles on nothing but letters and hope. I know you're brave enough to admit uncertainty instead of pretending everything is fine. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I think I know the parts that matter. She looked back at him, her blue eyes searching his face. You're very direct. Life's too short to dance around the truth. Is it always like this with you? This intense? He considered that. No. Usually I'm quiet to the point of being rude. Clara says I have the conversational skills of a fence post. But with you, he struggled to explain it. It doesn't feel like work. Talking to you, I mean. It feels like breathing. Color rose in her cheeks, and she looked down, but she was smiling. You should write that down. It's the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. Really? What kind of men have you been talking to? The wrong kind, apparently. They walked on, and Daniel showed her the rest of the town. The smithy, where a man named John hammered metal with the kind of precision that bordered on artistry. The saloon where the incident had happened last night, looking far less dramatic in daylight. The hotel owner's wife kept a garden behind the building, somehow coaxing vegetables from soil that seemed determined to produce nothing but rocks and stubborn weeds. Everywhere they went, people stared. Some nodded politely, others whispered behind their hands. Tom Reynolds appeared as they passed the general store and tipped his hat to Lillian with exaggerated courtesy. "Miss Moore, Mr. Cross. Fine morning after that storm, isn't it?" "Very fine," Lillian agreed. "Say, Daniel, I was wondering, you planning on being at the community meeting next week? We're discussing the school situation." "Wasn't planning on it. What's the issue?" Tom glanced at Lillian, seemed to make a decision. "Miss Patterson gave notice. She's retiring end of the summer, moving to Austin to live with her daughter. Which means we need to find someone to take over the school, and nobody's got any ideas who that should be." Daniel felt Lillian go very still beside him. Tom continued, oblivious. "Problem is, nobody qualified wants to come out here. The pay isn't much, the building's falling apart, and we don't exactly have a reputation for being welcoming to outsiders. We've had 3 teachers quit in the past 5 years before Miss Patterson, and she only stayed because she's too stubborn to quit anything." "That's a problem," Daniel agreed carefully. "Sure is. Anyway, if you've got any ideas, bring them to the meeting." Tom tipped his hat again. "Miss Moore, always a pleasure." When he was gone, Lillian let out a breath. That was pointed. Tom's not subtle, but he's not wrong either. The town needs someone. Daniel looked at her. "But that's a conversation for later. Right now, I want you to see the ranch. See what your days might look like if you decided to stay." They retrieved horses from the livery, a gentle mare for Lillian, Daniel's own gelding that he'd stabled before the storm. The ride out of town took them through landscape transformed by yesterday's snow. Everything was wet, dripping, the prairie grass flattened and mud sucking at the horses' hooves. But as they rode, the sun began breaking through the clouds, and steam rose from the ground in ghostly wisps. The world smelled clean, fresh, alive in a way that only came after storms. "It's beautiful," Lillian said, her voice quiet with wonder. "The letters described it, but this, you can't capture this in words." "No," Daniel agreed. "Some things you have to see to understand." The ranch appeared gradually, first the boundary fence, then the cattle scattered across the eastern pasture, then the house itself. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple wooden structure with a covered porch and a chimney that listed slightly to one side. But Daniel had built most of it with his own hands, and he felt a surge of nervous pride as Lillian took it in. "It's solid," she said, and he heard the approval in her voice. "Not trying to be something it's not." Before he could respond, the front door burst open and Clara came flying out, not even bothering with a coat despite the cold. She was 28, dark-haired and bright-eyed, and she reached Lillian's horse before Daniel had finished dismounting. "You're here! You're real! I was starting to think Danny had made you up entirely." Clara stopped herself, seemed to remember manners. "I'm Clara. I'm so happy to meet you. Come inside, you must be freezing. I have coffee ready and biscuits and—" "Danny, help her down. Don't just stand there like a post." Lillian was laughing as Daniel helped her dismount, her eyes bright with amusement. "Thank you. You must be Clara. Daniel's told me so much about you." "All bad, I'm sure. Don't believe a word. Come on." Clara practically dragged Lillian inside and Daniel followed, shaking his head. This was exactly what he'd expected, and somehow still more than he was prepared for. The inside of the house was warm, a fire crackling in the hearth. Clara had clearly been preparing for this visit. There were fresh flowers on the table, the floor had been swept recently, and the whole place smelled like baking bread. She settled Lillian into the most comfortable chair and pressed coffee into her hands before Lillian could even speak. "So," Clara said, settling across from her with eager intensity, "tell me everything, the journey, the storm, meeting Danny, all of it." "Clara," Daniel warned, "give her a chance to breathe." "She can breathe and talk. Women are excellent multitaskers." Clara turned back to Lillian. "Start with the train. Was it awful?" And somehow, Lillian didn't seem overwhelmed. She told the story of the journey, making it funny and dramatic at once, describing the other passengers and the delays and the moment when she'd stepped off the train into the blizzard and seen Daniel waiting. "He looked half frozen," Lillian said. "I couldn't believe he'd actually stayed." "That's Danny," Clara said with obvious pride. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as loyal. Once he makes up his mind about something, there's no moving him." They talked for over an hour, and Daniel watched as something shifted between the two women. Clara's initial excitement mellowed into genuine interest, and Lillian relaxed in a way she hadn't in town, her guard lowering as she recognized that Clara's warmth was real, not performance. Finally, Clara stood. "Come on, let me show you the rest of the place, and I've got some clothes that'll fit you better for riding around out here. That dress is lovely, but it's not practical." She led Lillian to the back rooms, their voices fading into easy conversation. Daniel stood alone in the main room, looking around at the space he'd built. For the first time, he tried to see it through Lillian's eyes. The rough furniture, the simple decorations, the practical rather than beautiful nature of everything. Would it be enough? Could a woman who'd known Boston society, who'd taught at prestigious academies, who'd been offered positions in San Francisco, could she really be happy here? Clara returned alone 20 minutes later, shutting the door behind her with exaggerated care. "She's changing. Now you have exactly 5 minutes to answer my questions before she comes back." "Clara, do you love her?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "We just met in person yesterday." "That's not an answer. Do you love her?" Daniel sat down heavily on the bench by the door. Did he? He'd been asking himself the same question since last night, since he'd watched her face down danger with nothing but courage and quick thinking. Since he'd walked with her through town this morning and felt something click into place, like a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. "I think I could," he said finally. "Easily. Maybe too easily." Clara's expression softened. "She's perfect for you, Danny. She's smart, she's brave, she doesn't need you to rescue her or complete her, she's already complete on her own. But you can see it in the way she looks at you. She wants this. She's scared, but she wants it. What if I'm not enough? What if she stays and then regrets it? What if she leaves and spends the rest of her life regretting not finding out?" Clara moved closer, put her hand on his shoulder. "You can't protect people from their own choices. You can only be honest about what you're offering, and then let them decide." The door opened and Lillian emerged wearing borrowed clothes, simple pants, a practical shirt, boots that had seen better days. She looked completely different from the proper Eastern lady who'd stepped off the train, and yet somehow more herself. "These fit perfectly," she said to Clara. "Thank you." "Keep them. I've got plenty." Clara grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. "Now I'm going to check on the cattle in the north pasture and leave you two alone to talk. Daniel, show her everything, the good and the bad. And Lillian," she paused at the door, "he's not going to try to sell you on staying. He's too honest for that. So if you want to know what a life here would really be like, you'll have to ask." Then she was gone, leaving them alone in the warm house with the fire crackling and the afternoon stretching ahead. "She's direct too," Lillian observed. "It runs in the family." Daniel stood, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been in town. "Come on, let me show you the rest." They walked the property together, Daniel pointing out the barn, the chicken coop, the vegetable garden Clara maintained with fierce determination. He showed her the cattle, explained the work of managing them, the constant battle against weather and disease and predators. He was honest about the failures too, the year they'd lost half the herd to fever, the times he'd gone to sleep not knowing if the ranch would survive another season. "It's not romantic," he said as they stood looking out over the pasture. "Not like books make it seem. It's dirt and sweat and worry." "I never wanted romantic," Lillian said. "I wanted real." They walked to the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his land. The water was running high from the melted snow, rushing over rocks with a sound like constant applause. They sat on the bank, shoulders close but not touching, watching the water flow past. "Can I ask you something?" Lillian said finally. "Anything." "Why did you let Clara place that advertisement? When she first did it, you were angry. You wrote about it in your third letter, but you didn't make her take it back. Why?" Daniel picked up a stone, turned it over in his hand. "Because she was right. I was going to die alone and stubborn, convinced that this," he gestured at the land around them, "was enough. The work, the land, the satisfaction of building something. And it was enough, for a long time. But then I'd go to town and see families, see what I was missing, and I'd feel this hollow place inside me. Like I'd built everything except the part that mattered." He threw the stone into the creek, watched it disappear into the rushing water. The letter started out as just curiosity. Maybe a friend, someone to write to. But then you wrote back and you understood things I'd never been able to explain to anyone. The way the land gets in your blood. The satisfaction of honest work. The feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself. He looked at her. By the time I realized I was falling for you, it was too late to stop. Lillian was quiet for a long moment. Then, I was engaged once, 3 years ago. Daniel's chest tightened, but he stayed silent, letting her tell it her way. His name was Robert. He was a lawyer from a good family. Everything about him looked perfect on paper, educated, successful, charming. My headmistress encouraged the match. All my friends envied me. She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. 6 weeks before the wedding, I found out he'd been keeping a mistress. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. He said marriage was about partnership and position, and love was, what was the phrase? A pleasant fiction for the naive. I'm sorry. I'm not anymore, because it taught me something important. I'd rather be alone than settle for something hollow. I'd rather die having tried for something real and failed than spend my whole life in a comfortable lie. She turned to face him, her blue eyes serious. That's why I came here, Daniel, because your letters were the first thing that felt real in years. You weren't trying to impress me or manipulate me. You were just you, honest and direct and willing to admit when you didn't know something. And I thought, maybe that's what love is supposed to feel like. Not butterflies and drama, but recognition. Finding someone and thinking, oh, there you are. Daniel felt like he couldn't breathe. Is that what you felt? When you saw me on the platform? Yes. Her voice was steady, certain. I was terrified you wouldn't be there, that the storm would have kept you away, that I'd built up this whole fantasy in my head. And then I saw you, standing there half frozen, and I thought, she smiled slightly. I thought, he's even more stubborn than I imagined. And also, oh, there you are. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't. She met him halfway, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining. Her hand was smaller than his, softer, despite the cold, and holding it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I don't know if I can do this, she said quietly. Build a life here, so far from everything I know. I don't know if I'm brave enough. You're the bravest person I've ever met. You faced down a gunman. You traveled 2,000 miles for something uncertain. You're sitting here considering giving up a prestigious position in San Francisco to maybe, possibly, teach in a falling-apart school in a frontier town. He squeezed her hand gently. Bravery isn't not being scared. It's being terrified and doing it anyway. Is that what you are? Terrified? Completely. I'm terrified you'll leave. I'm terrified you'll stay and regret it. I'm terrified I'm not enough, that this place isn't enough, that I'll fail you somehow. He met her eyes. But I'm more terrified of not trying. They sat there by the creek as the sun moved lower in the sky, hands joined, both scared and hopeful, and caught in that strange space between what was and what might be. Clara came back eventually, calling from the house that she'd made dinner. They walked back together, Lillian keeping her hand in his even as they approached the warm lights of home. Dinner was simple but good, venison stew and fresh bread, vegetables from the root cellar. Clara entertained them with stories about Daniel as a child, much to his embarrassment and Lillian's obvious delight. The evening passed in easy warmth, the kind of comfort that came from people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. When it was time to ride back to town, Daniel saddled the horses while Clara pulled Lillian aside for what looked like an intense conversation. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw Lillian nod several times, saw her hug Clara tightly before they parted. The ride back was quiet, both of them tired but content. The moon had risen, nearly full, turning the prairie silver. Their horses walked side by side, close enough that Daniel's legs sometimes brushed against Lillian's. Clara likes you, he said finally. I like her too. She's wonderful. What did she say to you? At the end? Lillian smiled. She told me that you'd never push me to decide, never pressure me to stay or go, and that if I wanted to know what you're really thinking, what you really hope for, I'd have to ask you directly because you're too honorable to influence me. That sounds like Clara. So I'm asking, what do you hope for, Daniel? He took a breath, chose honesty over safety. I hope you stay. I hope you take that teaching position they're desperate to fill. I hope you give us time to figure out if what we have in letters translates to what we need in life. And if it does," he paused, then pushed forward. "If it does, I hope you marry me. I hope we build something together that matters, something that lasts. I hope we fill that house with noise and life and all the things I didn't know I was missing until I met you." Lillian was quiet for so long he thought he'd said too much, pushed too hard. But when he looked over, he saw tears on her cheeks, catching the moonlight. "That's what I hope for too," she whispered. "Exactly that." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, full rather than empty, charged with possibility rather than uncertainty. When they reached the hotel, Daniel helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll show you the town meeting house, introduce you to more people, let you see what the community is really like." "I'd like that." "And Lillian?" He waited until she looked up at him. "Thank you for coming all this way, for being brave enough to try." She reached up, touched his cheek gently. "Thank you for waiting in the storm." Then she was gone, disappearing into the hotel, leaving Daniel standing in the street with his heart pounding and his mind racing with hope and fear in equal measure. He rode his horse back to the livery, took care of the animal with automatic movements, his thoughts elsewhere. 2 days. She'd been here 2 days, and already he couldn't imagine his life without her in it. The letters had been the beginning, but this, walking together, talking together, building something real and solid, this was what he wanted. This was what he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. Above him, the stars wheeled across a clear sky, the storm finally blown out completely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions to answer. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Cross allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth all the risk. The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, as though Daniel and Lillian were discovering something that had always existed, waiting for them to find it. Each morning, Daniel would meet her at the hotel, and they would walk through town together, or ride out to the ranch. She met the families whose children would be her students if she stayed. She spent an afternoon with Miss Patterson, who proved to be exactly as formidable as advertised, but who softened considerably when Lillian discussed educational philosophy with the kind of depth that suggested genuine expertise rather than fashionable opinions. "You'll do," Miss Patterson had said finally, which from her was apparently the highest praise possible. "The children will test you, they always do, but you've got spine. That matters more than all the book learning in the world." The town meeting had gone well, too. Daniel had sat in the back while Lillian spoke to the gathered families about her vision for the school. Not just teaching facts, but fostering curiosity, not just preparing children for the lives they were expected to live, but giving them tools to imagine different possibilities. She'd been nervous beforehand, her hands shaking slightly as she reviewed her notes. But once she started speaking, the nervousness had fallen away, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. By the time she finished, the decision was unanimous. They wanted her. The position was hers if she chose to take it. "I need a few more days," she'd told them, "to be certain. This is a significant decision, and I want to be fair to everyone involved." They'd understood, or at least they'd pretended to, but Daniel could see the hope in their faces, could feel the way the community was already beginning to claim her as one of their own. That had been 3 days ago. Now it was late April, the weather had turned warm, and wildflowers were beginning to dot the prairie in explosions of color. Daniel and Lillian were riding back from the eastern boundary of his property, where he'd shown her the site where he hoped to build a new barn before winter. The conversation had been easy, comfortable, punctuated by long silences that felt companionable rather than awkward. But underneath the ease, Daniel could feel tension building. Lillian needed to make a decision soon. The San Francisco position had sent a telegram requesting her answer. The school board in Abilene needed to know if they should continue searching for a teacher. And Daniel needed to know if the life he was beginning to imagine had any chance of becoming real. They were perhaps a mile from the ranch house when Lillian pulled her horse to a stop. Daniel reined in beside her, concerned. Everything all right? She was staring at something in the distance, her expression suddenly tense. Daniel followed her gaze and felt his own body go rigid. 3 riders were approaching from the south, moving at an easy pace but with obvious purpose. Even from a distance, Daniel recognized the lead rider. Roy Calder, the stranger from the saloon that first night, the card sharp who'd nearly shot Pete Morrison. Daniel had assumed, hoped, that Calder had left town after that incident, moved on to whatever new place men like him drifted to. But apparently he'd stayed, or he'd come back, and the way he was riding directly toward them suggested this wasn't a chance encounter. Daniel? Lillian's voice was quiet, controlled, but he heard the fear underneath. It's all right. Stay close to me. They waited as the 3 riders approached. Calder was in the lead, dressed in the same too fancy clothes, his face showing several days of stubble but his eyes sharp and calculating. The 2 men with him were rougher types, hired muscle by the look of them, the kind of men who solved problems with fists and guns rather than words. Calder pulled his horse to a stop about 10 feet away, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Cross, Miss Moore, what a pleasant surprise running into you out here. Calder. Daniel kept his voice neutral, his hand resting casually near his hip where his gun sat. He'd started wearing it again after that first night, a precaution that now seemed prescient. Thought you'd moved on. I had considered it, but then I got to thinking about this town, about the opportunities here, and I realized I'd been too hasty in my departure plans. His eyes moved to Lillian, lingering in a way that made Daniel's jaw tighten. Plus, I heard there was a beautiful school teacher considering staying in Abilene. Thought I should introduce myself properly, without all that unpleasantness from before. We've met, Lillian said coolly. I don't believe a second introduction is necessary. Calder's smile widened. Direct. I like that in a woman. Shows character. He leaned forward in his saddle, his tone shifting to something falsely friendly. See, I've been making some inquiries around town, learning about people, getting a sense of the community, and I keep hearing your name, Miss Moore, the educated lady from Boston who might bring some culture to this backwater, the woman who's caught Daniel Cross's eye. What's your point, Calder? Daniel's voice had gone cold. My point is that a woman of Miss Moore's obvious qualities shouldn't limit her options so quickly. You're considering staying here, teaching school, maybe settling down with a rancher who can barely keep his property afloat in good years. Calder's eyes flicked to Daniel with barely concealed contempt. But there are other possibilities. Other men who could offer more. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous, but he forced himself to stay calm. Men like Calder wanted a reaction, fed on making others lose control. I'm not interested in other possibilities, Lillian said, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. And I don't appreciate being spoken about as though I'm a commodity to be evaluated and acquired. Everything is a commodity if you know its value. Calder's smile had turned predatory. And you, Miss Moore, are extremely valuable, beautiful, educated, refined. A woman like you could do very well for herself with the right man, someone with means, with connections, with a future that extends beyond dirt and cattle. That's enough. Daniel moved his horse forward, positioning himself between Calder and Lillian. You've said your piece, now move on. Or what? One of Calder's companions spoke for the first time, his hand drifting toward his gun. You'll do what, exactly? The moment stretched, taut as a wire, everyone aware of how quickly this could turn deadly. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities, calculating distances, angles, the likelihood that he could get Lillian to safety if shooting started. His hand was steady near his gun, but he knew the odds. 3 against 1, and Lillian in the crossfire. Then Lillian urged her horse forward, moving past Daniel before he could stop her. She pulled up directly in front of Calder, close enough that he had to look up slightly to meet her eyes. Mr. Calder, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that Daniel had heard her use when discussing education, the tone of someone who expected to be obeyed. I'm going to explain something to you very clearly because I believe you've misunderstood the situation. I am not available, I am not interested, and I am not going to be swayed by whatever you believe you have to offer. Calder's smile had frozen on his face, uncertain now. Furthermore, Lillian continued. If you continue to pursue this course of action, if you continue to make unwanted advances, to follow us, to make implications about my character or my choices, I will ensure that every family in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are. And since I'm planning to become their children's teacher, I assure you they will listen to me far more readily than they'll listen to you. She paused, letting that sink in, then added with devastating politeness. Now, I believe you and your companions were just leaving, weren't you? For a long moment, Calder stared at her, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, and something that looked disturbingly like increased interest. Then he laughed, a sound without real humor. You're quite something, Miss Moore, quite something indeed. He gathered his reins, preparing to ride off, but his eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made Daniel's skin crawl. I look forward to continuing our acquaintance. We have no acquaintance. Not yet, but this is a small town, and I'm a patient man. We'll be seeing each other again. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his two companions following. They didn't look back, but Daniel watched them until they disappeared over a rise in the distance, his heart still pounding with adrenaline and fury. Lillian. She held up a hand, stopping him. Her face had gone pale, and now that Calder was gone, he could see her hands shaking where they gripped the reins. Please, let's just get back to the house. I need a moment. They rode in silence, but Daniel kept scanning the horizon, watching for any sign that Calder might return. When they reached the ranch, Clara took one look at their faces and immediately ushered Lillian inside without asking questions. Daniel stayed outside, pacing the porch, trying to work through the rage and fear churning in his gut. 20 minutes later, Clara emerged, closing the door quietly behind her. She's all right. Shaken, but all right. She's drinking tea and pretending her hands aren't still trembling. Clara studied his face. You want to tell me what happened? Daniel told her, the words coming out clipped and angry. Clara's expression darkened as he spoke. Roy Calder. I've heard that name. He's been in town for about a week now, playing cards at the saloon, asking questions about people. Tom Reynolds mentioned him, said Calder was inquiring about property for sale, acting like he might settle here. He's not staying. He's hunting. Hunting what? I don't know. Money, maybe. An easy mark. Or... Daniel stopped himself, but Clara finished the thought. Or Lillian. He looked at her like she was something to be won, to be taken. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Men like him, they see something they want, and they don't care about anything else. Not her feelings, not her choices, nothing. What are you going to do? I don't know. If I confront him directly, it'll just escalate things, but if I don't, he looked at Clara helplessly. I can't let him keep threatening her. It's not your decision alone. Lillian gets a say in this. As if summoned by her name, the door opened and Lillian stepped out. Her color was better and her hands were steady now, but her eyes held a hard determination that Daniel hadn't seen before. We need to talk, she said. All three of us. They sat on the porch, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, and Lillian spoke with the careful precision of someone who had been thinking through every word. I want to stay, she said first, looking directly at Daniel. I want to take the teaching position. I want to see if what we're building together can become something permanent. I've known that for days, but I've been afraid to say it out loud, afraid that saying it would somehow jinx it or make it too real or... She shook her head. But I'm not going to let Roy Calder or anyone else make that decision for me through fear. Relief flooded through Daniel, so intense it was almost painful. You're sure? I'm certain. I've sent a telegram to San Francisco declining their position. I've told the school board here I'll start in the fall. She paused, seemed to gather courage. I've made my choice, and it's you. It's this place, this life, but Calder complicates things, Clara finished. Yes, because I won't live in fear. I won't spend every day looking over my shoulder wondering if he's going to appear. And I won't let him drive me away from something I want. Lillian's voice was steady, but underneath it Daniel heard steel. So we need a plan, not just hoping he'll lose interest and leave, but an actual plan to make sure he understands that his attention is not welcome and will not be tolerated. They talked for over an hour, laying out possibilities. Daniel could speak to the sheriff, though Sheriff Morrison was Pete's brother and might be more inclined to start a fight than prevent one. Clara suggested that Lillian make her position clear to the community, ensuring that everyone knew she was spoken for and that Calder's interest was unwanted. Lillian proposed that they simply refuse to engage, giving Calder nothing to work with, letting his interest die from lack of fuel. In the end, they decided on a combination of all three approaches. Daniel would speak to the sheriff, making sure there was a record of Calder's behavior. Lillian would begin her preparations for teaching, making her commitment to staying public and official. And they would both be careful, aware, never alone in situations where Calder might have opportunity to approach. It felt insufficient, like building a wall of paper against a storm, but it was something. Over the next week, they proceeded with cautious optimism. Lillian moved from the hotel into a small house near the school that the town provided for teachers. Daniel helped her settle in, along with Clara and several of the mothers whose children would be in her class. The community embraced her fully now, no longer tentative about a stranger, but welcoming her as one of their own. Daniel found himself at her house most evenings, ostensibly helping with preparations for the school year, but really just wanting to be near her. They would sit on her small porch as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for the future with increasing confidence. "I was thinking," Lillian said one evening, "about expanding the curriculum. Not just basic reading and arithmetic, but science. Maybe bringing in specimens, teaching the children to observe and question and experiment. The parents would love that. Practical knowledge they can use. It's not just practical, it's teaching them how to think, how to approach problems systematically, how to test ideas rather than just accepting what they're told." She was animated now, her hands moving as she spoke. That's what education should be. Not memorizing facts, but learning how to learn. Daniel watched her, feeling something fierce and protective and tender all at once. This was what she was meant to do, he realized. Not hosting tea parties in Boston or teaching deportment in San Francisco, but here, shaping young minds in a place where that shaping could make a real difference. "What?" she asked, catching him staring. "Just thinking about how lucky those kids are going to be, having you as their teacher." She smiled, reaching over to take his hand. "And how lucky I am, having you. I wouldn't have had the courage to do this without—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on something beyond Daniel's shoulder. He turned to see Roy Calder standing at the gate to her small yard, one hand resting casually on the fence post, watching them with that same predatory smile. "Good evening," Calder said pleasantly, as though his appearance wasn't a violation of everything they'd discussed. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Daniel was on his feet instantly, moving to position himself between Calder and Lillian. "You are. Leave." "Now, is that any way to greet a neighbor? I was just taking an evening walk, saw you two sitting here so cozy-like, thought I'd stop by and offer my congratulations." Calder's eyes moved past Daniel to Lillian. "Heard you're taking the teaching position. That's wonderful news. The children will be so fortunate." "Mr. Calder, you need to leave now." Lillian had stood as well, her voice firm despite the tension in her shoulders. I will. But first..." He reached into his coat, and Daniel's hand went to his gun, but Calder just pulled out an envelope. "I wanted to give you this. A small welcoming gift, you might say." "We don't want anything from you," Daniel said. "It's not from me exactly. It's information about your fiancé here." Calder's smile widened at Daniel's reaction. "Oh, you didn't know? That Miss Moore was engaged to a lawyer named Robert Hartley back in Boston? That the engagement ended quite suddenly and with some scandal attached?" Daniel felt Lillian go rigid beside him, but he didn't take his eyes off Calder. "I know everything I need to know about Lillian. Her past is her business, not yours and not mine, unless she chooses to share it." "Very noble. But the thing about the past is that it has a way of catching up to people. And I wonder what the good families of Abilene would think, knowing their children's teacher had such an interesting history." Calder set the envelope on the fence post. "Just some things to consider. No pressure, of course. But if Miss Moore wanted to perhaps reconsider her options, to have a conversation with someone who understands the complications of society and reputation, well, I'm staying at the hotel, room 7. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and walked away, leaving the envelope behind like a poisonous seed. Daniel waited until Calder was out of sight, then turned to find Lillian staring at the envelope with an expression he couldn't read. Her face was pale, her hands clenched at her sides. "Don't," she said before he could speak. "Don't look at it. Whatever he's collected, whatever stories he's dug up or invented, I don't want it to have power over us. I don't care what's in there." Daniel took her hands, felt them trembling. "I meant what I said. Your past is yours. You'll tell me what you want to tell me when you want to tell me. Nobody else gets to decide that. He's trying to control me through fear, through shame." Her voice was shaking now, anger mixing with fear. "He's trying to make me feel like I have something to hide, something to be ashamed of." "Do you?" "No." She met his eyes, and he saw fury there alongside the fear. "I was engaged. He cheated. I ended it, and there was gossip because his family was influential, and they spread stories to protect their reputation. None of that is shameful. None of that is anything I need to apologize for or hide from." "Then Calder has nothing. He's bluffing, trying to scare you into what? Leaving? Going to him? Whatever he wants, he won't get it." But even as he said it, Daniel felt unease building. Men like Calder didn't make moves without a plan. The envelope, the veiled threats, they were all building toward something. That night, lying in his bed at the ranch with sleep refusing to come, Daniel made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go to the sheriff with everything. He would make it official, create a record, ensure that if Calder tried anything, there would be consequences. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough, but it was something. He must have finally fallen asleep because he woke to pounding on his door and Clara's voice tight with panic. "Danny, get up! Now!" He was out of bed and fully alert instantly, grabbing his gun from the bedside table. Clara burst in without waiting for permission, her face pale in the pre-dawn light. "It's Lillian. She's gone." Ice water flooded his veins. "What do you mean, gone?" "I went to her house to help with something she wanted to prepare for school. The door was open. The place looked like someone had searched it, and this—" Clara thrust a piece of paper at him. "This was on the table." Daniel's hand shook as he read the note. The handwriting was rough, clearly not Lillian's. "If you want to see her alive, come alone to the old Morrison mine at dawn. No sheriff. No help. Just you. Tell anyone. And she dies." The paper crumpled in his fist as rage and terror warred in his chest. The Morrison mine had been abandoned for years, a dangerous place of unstable tunnels and deadly drops. If Calder had taken her there, if he'd hurt her— "I'm going," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You can't go alone. That's insane. It's obviously a trap." "I know it's a trap. I don't care. Danny, he has her, Clara. He has her. And if I don't go, if I bring the sheriff or try to be clever about it—" His voice broke. "I can't risk her. I can't." Clara's eyes were wet, but she nodded. "Then I'm getting Tom and the others. We'll follow at a distance. You go in alone like he says, but we'll be close enough to help when things go wrong." Daniel wanted to argue, but there was no time. Dawn was perhaps 30 minutes away, and the mine was a hard ride. He dressed quickly, checked his gun, grabbed extra ammunition. His mind was working through scenarios, possibilities, but underneath the calculation was pure, primal fear. If Calder hurt her, if he touched her, if anything happened to her because of Daniel's presence in her life. No. He couldn't think like that. He had to stay focused, stay smart. Calder wanted something, and men who wanted something could be negotiated with, manipulated, stopped. Daniel just had to figure out what that something was before it was too late. The ride to the mine was the longest of his life. Every minute felt like an hour, every mile like 100. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, stars fading as dawn approached. The air smelled of sage and dust and something else. Rain coming, maybe. Another storm rolling in. The Morrison mine was a scar on the landscape. The entrance a dark mouth in the hillside surrounded by rotting timbers and rusted equipment. Daniel's horse balked as they approached, sensing danger in that instinctive way animals had. He dismounted 100 yards out, tied the horse to a stunted tree, and approached on foot. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of his boots on gravel and his heart hammering in his chest. "Calder!" His voice echoed off the rocks. "I'm here. Let her go." For a long moment, nothing. Then Calder emerged from the mine entrance and Daniel's blood went cold. He had a gun in one hand and his other hand gripped Lillian's arm, holding her in front of him like a shield. She was alive, awake, her face bruised and her dress torn, but her eyes met Daniel's with fierce determination. "Right on time," Calder said. "I appreciate punctuality. Let her go. Whatever this is about, it's between you and me." "That's where you're wrong, Cross. This isn't about you at all. You're just, what's the word, collateral damage." Calder's smile was terrible in the growing light. "This is about what she represents. Opportunity, value, a chance at something better than cards and whiskey." "I told you," Lillian said, her voice hoarse but strong. "I'm not interested. You can't force someone to—" Calder's hand tightened on her arm, hard enough to make her gasp, and Daniel took an involuntary step forward. Calder's gun immediately came up, pointed at Lillian's head. "Don't," Calder said softly. "I'd hate for this to end badly. I really would. Because here's what's going to happen. Miss Moore and I are going to leave here together. We're going to ride to the next town, and then the next, and eventually somewhere far from Texas where nobody knows us. And she's going to do exactly what I tell her to do, because she's smart enough to understand that compliance keeps her alive." "You're insane," Daniel said. "You can't just kidnap someone and think, I can do whatever I want." That's what you frontier types don't understand. Rules, laws, consequences, those are for people who lack imagination and will. Calder's eyes glittered with something unhinged. "I saw her that first night standing there so brave and beautiful, and I knew. She was wasted on you, on this place. She deserves better. She deserves to make her own choices," Daniel interrupted, his mind racing, looking for an opening, any opportunity. "If you actually cared about her, you'd let her go." "I do care. That's why I'm saving her from a life of mediocrity, with a failed rancher in a dying town." Calder began backing toward the mine entrance, pulling Lillian with him. "Don't follow us, Cross. Don't make this complicated. Just let her go, and maybe someday she'll thank you for it." "Daniel!" Lillian's voice cracked. "Don't let him—" Whatever she was going to say was cut off as Calder yanked her backward into the mine entrance. The darkness swallowed them, leaving Daniel standing alone in the growing dawn, his gun useless in his hand, his mind screaming at him to move, to think, to do something. He ran forward, reaching the entrance just as he heard Lillian scream somewhere in the darkness below. The sound echoed through the tunnels, bouncing off stone walls, and then there was a gunshot, deafening in the confined space, and silence. Daniel plunged into the darkness without hesitation, following the tunnel downward, his boots slipping on loose gravel. He could hear movement ahead, voices echoing strangely. Then light appeared, lamplight, flickering from a side tunnel. He rounded the corner and found them. Calder had Lillian backed against a support beam, his gun pressed to her stomach. But Lillian was fighting, clawing at his face, her fear transformed into fury. The earlier shot must have missed because neither of them appeared wounded. "Stop fighting," Calder was saying, his voice ragged. "Just stop and this can be easy." Daniel fired. The shot went wide intentionally, sparking off rock near Calder's head, making him flinch backward. In that instant, Lillian drove her elbow into his throat with vicious accuracy. Calder staggered, gasping, his gun hand wavering, and Daniel charged forward. They went down in a tangle of limbs and fury, rolling across the tunnel floor. Calder's gun went flying, clattering into darkness. Daniel felt knuckles connect with his jaw, tasted blood, drove his fist into Calder's ribs with all his strength. They were both fighting with desperate savagery now. No technique, just the raw need to survive, to win, to end this. Daniel got on top, landed 2 solid punches that snapped Calder's head back. He drew back for another when Lillian's voice cut through his rage. "Daniel, stop! You'll kill him!" He froze, fist raised, looking down at Calder's bloodied face. The man was conscious but dazed, no longer fighting. And Daniel realized that he'd been about to keep hitting him, keep going until... He climbed off, breathing hard, his hands shaking with adrenaline and the horror of what he'd almost done. Lillian was beside him instantly, her arms around him, her face pressed against his chest. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over. You stopped him." Behind them, voices echoed through the tunnel. Clara, Tom, the sheriff, everyone who'd followed despite his instructions to come alone. They emerged into the lamplight and took in the scene with practiced efficiency. Sheriff Morrison hauled Calder to his feet, roughly cuffing his hands behind his back. "Roy Calder," Morrison said formally, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. And that's just for starters." Calder's eyes found Lillian one last time, and there was something in his expression, not remorse, but confusion, as though he genuinely couldn't understand why his plan had failed. "I could have given you everything," he said to her. "You had nothing I wanted," she replied, her voice steady despite the bruises and torn dress. "Nothing at all." They led him away, his protests fading as they dragged him toward the surface. Daniel and Lillian stayed in the tunnel for another moment, holding each other, letting the truth of survival sink in. "Are you hurt?" Daniel finally pulled back enough to examine her face, seeing the bruises more clearly now in the lamplight. "Nothing serious. He grabbed me from the house before dawn, said he'd kill me if I screamed. Brought me here, kept talking about how we were leaving together, how I'd understand eventually." She shuddered. "Daniel, if you hadn't come—" "I came. I'll always come, no matter what." He cupped her face gently, mindful of the bruises. "I love you, Lillian. I should have said it before. Should have said it a dozen times already, but I'm saying it now. I love you." Tears spilled down her cheeks, catching the lamplight. "I love you too. I've loved you since your third letter, when you wrote about watching the sunrise alone and wishing you had someone to share it with. I've loved you through all of this." They kissed there in the darkness of an abandoned mine, surrounded by danger and violence, and somehow it felt like the most perfect moment of Daniel's life. Not because of where they were, but because they'd survived. They'd fought for each other, protected each other, and made it through to the other side. When they finally emerged into full daylight, the sun was just breaking over the horizon, turning the whole world gold and new. Clara ran to them, embracing them both, tears streaming down her face. Tom and the others surrounded them, offering support and asking questions and generally making the kind of fuss that comes from people who care deeply and were desperately afraid. The ride back to town was slow, giving them time to process everything. Calder would be held until a circuit judge arrived, then tried and certainly convicted. His two accomplices had already run, disappearing in the night, but they were no real threat without him. It was over. The danger had passed, and somehow, impossibly, they were both alive and together and facing a future that stretched out before them full of possibility rather than threat. The town doctor insisted on examining Lillian, despite her protests that she was fine. Daniel sat outside the examination room at Doc Henderson's office, his hands still shaking slightly with adrenaline that wouldn't fade. Clara sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder in silent support. When the door finally opened, Doc Henderson emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was a grizzled man in his 60s who'd seen every kind of injury the frontier could produce, and his expression was professionally neutral. "She's bruised, but nothing's broken," he said. "The marks on her arms will fade in a week or so. I've given her something for the pain and told her to rest, but knowing Miss Moore, she'll ignore that advice completely. Can I see her? She's asking for you. Go on in." Lillian was sitting on the examination table, her torn dress replaced with a simple borrowed one, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked exhausted but alert, and when Daniel entered, her face transformed with relief. "The doctor says I'm fine," she said before he could ask. "Bruises, scrapes, nothing serious." "Nothing serious," Daniel repeated, moving to stand in front of her. "You were kidnapped and held at gunpoint, and—" His voice broke. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. This happened because of me, because Calder saw you with me and decided—" "Stop." Lillian took his hands, gripped them firmly. "This happened because Roy Calder is a dangerous, delusional man who wouldn't accept no for an answer. That's not your fault. That's not my fault. That's only his fault. If I hadn't been standing on that platform, if I hadn't pursued this, you'd be safe in Boston or on your way to San Francisco. If you hadn't been standing on that platform, I'd still be teaching girls how to curtsy and wondering if there was anything more to life than polite society and empty conversations." She pulled him closer, made him look at her. "I chose this, Daniel. I chose you. I chose this place. I chose a life that matters over a life that's merely comfortable. And yes, that choice came with danger I didn't anticipate. But I'm not sorry I made it. You could have died. But I didn't. You came for me, you saved me, and now it's over, and we're both alive, and we get to move forward. She touched his face, her fingers gentle on his bruised jaw. That's what matters. Not what could have happened, but what did happen. We survived. The door opened, and Sheriff Morrison entered, his hat in his hands, looking apologetic for the interruption. Miss Moore, Mr. Cross? I hate to intrude, but I need to get official statements from both of you for the trial. They spent the next hour recounting everything, from Calder's first appearance at the saloon to his veiled threats to the kidnapping itself. Morrison took notes in careful handwriting, asking clarifying questions, building a case that would ensure Calder never threatened anyone again. Judge Harrison will be here in 2 weeks for the circuit, Morrison said finally, closing his notebook. Calder will stay locked up until then. I've got him in the cell, and I'm posting a guard just to be safe. The man's got no friends here, no one to help him escape. But I'm not taking chances. What's he saying? Daniel asked. Has he confessed? In his way, keeps insisting he was trying to help Miss Moore, that he was saving her from a life she didn't deserve. Man's not right in the head, if you ask me. Thinks he's some kind of romantic hero instead of a kidnapper. Morrison shook his head in disgust. But that's not your problem anymore. You two just focus on healing and moving forward. When Morrison left, Doc Henderson declared Lillian fit to leave, but insisted she go straight home and rest. Clara volunteered to stay with her, help her get settled, make sure she ate something. Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to stay by her side every moment, but Lillian squeezed his hand and shook her head slightly. I need a few hours to process all this, she said quietly, to just sit and breathe and let it all settle. Clara will take care of me. You should go home, clean up, get some rest yourself. You look half dead. He wanted to protest, but she was right. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving him hollow and exhausted. His hands hurt from the fight, his jaw ached where Calder had connected, and his mind felt sluggish, unable to fully process everything that had happened in the past few hours. Tonight, he said, I'll come by tonight to check on you. I'd like that. He kissed her forehead, careful of the bruises, then let Clara lead him outside. The sun was high now, the day well underway, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since he'd woken to Clara's panicked voice. The town was buzzing with news of the kidnapping and rescue, people gathering in small groups to whisper and speculate. Daniel rode back to the ranch in a daze, his body moving on autopilot while his mind replayed the morning over and over. The terror of finding that note, the desperate ride to the mine, the moment he'd seen Calder holding a gun to Lillian's head, the fight, the rage, the horrible realization of what he'd almost done in his fury. At the ranch, he stripped off his torn, bloody clothes and washed in cold water from the pump, scrubbing away dirt and blood and the physical residue of violence. But he couldn't wash away the memory of it, the feeling of his fists connecting with flesh, the dark satisfaction he'd felt in hurting the man who'd hurt Lillian. He'd been ready to kill Calder, would have killed him if Lillian hadn't stopped him. And the worst part was that he still wasn't sure if he regretted being stopped. He dressed in clean clothes and tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't settle. Finally, he gave up and went to the barn, losing himself in work. He mucked stalls, repaired tack, organized tools that didn't need organizing, physical labor to quiet the thoughts that wouldn't stop circling. He was replacing a broken hinge on one of the stall doors when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Tom Reynolds standing in the barn doorway, his expression serious. Heard you were back. Thought I'd check on you. I'm fine. You're not. Neither is she. What happened this morning, that's not something you just shake off. Tom moved closer, leaned against the stall door. I've seen men after violence before. The ones who pretend it didn't affect them are the ones who fall apart later. Daniel set down his tools, suddenly too tired to maintain the pretense. I almost killed him, Tom. Would have, if Lillian hadn't stopped me. And part of me wishes she hadn't. That's normal. The man kidnapped the woman you love, threatened to kill her. Of course you wanted to hurt him. But I'm not supposed to want that. I'm supposed to be better than that, supposed to... He struggled to articulate it. Violence is supposed to be a last resort, something you do because you have to, not because you want to. But in that moment, I wanted it. I wanted to hurt him for what he'd done. Tom was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I think there's a difference between wanting to protect someone and wanting to cause harm. You went into that mine to save Lillian, not to kill Calder. The violence was necessary, not desired. And you stopped when she asked you to, which means you're still in control. That's what matters. Is it? Danny, you're one of the best men I know. Honest, hardworking, decent to your core. What happened today doesn't change that. It just proves you're human, that you can be pushed to your limits like anyone else. The measure of a man isn't whether he feels anger or rage, it's what he does with those feelings. Tom straightened, prepared to leave. Talk to Lillian. Let her help you process this. You don't have to carry it alone. After Tom left, Daniel returned to his work with slightly less fervor, the words settling into his mind like seeds in soil. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe the fact that he'd stopped, that he'd chosen control over revenge, was what mattered. But the knowledge of what he'd been capable of in that moment would stay with him, a reminder that civilization and savagery existed in the same person, separated only by circumstances and choice. The afternoon faded into evening, and finally, Daniel rode back into town. Lillian's house showed lamplight in the windows, warm and inviting against the gathering darkness. He knocked softly, and Clara opened the door. She's been asking for you every 10 minutes, Clara said with a tired smile. Go on in. I'm heading back to the ranch. You'll stay with her tonight? If she wants me to. She does. Make sure she actually eats something, and don't let her stay up too late talking. She needs rest. Clara paused at the door. Danny? I'm proud of you. What you did today, that took courage. After she left, Daniel found Lillian sitting in a chair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, her hair still loose around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and her whole face softened with relief. You came. Did you think I wouldn't? I worried you might need space, after everything. She gestured to the chair beside her. Sit with me? He sat, and for a long moment they just looked at each other, taking inventory, confirming that both were real and present and safe. Then Lillian reached over and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. Clara made soup, she said, and bread. She's convinced food solves everything. Does it? It helps. I made her go home, but only after promising I'd eat and rest and not do anything strenuous. She smiled slightly. I'm not very good at following doctor's orders. I noticed that about you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire. The warmth, the quiet, the simple fact of being together, it was exactly what they both needed. No words could adequately address what they'd been through, so they didn't try. They just existed in the same space, letting proximity and touch speak what language couldn't. Finally, Lillian stirred. Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Always. Are you having second thoughts? About us? About me staying here? Because if today showed you that this life comes with dangers you're not willing to accept, no. He turned to face her fully. Lillian, no. What happened today was terrifying, and yes, it showed me how much I could lose. But it also showed me what I already knew, that you're worth any risk, any fear, any danger. I'm not having second thoughts. Are you? She shook her head, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. I was so scared. Not of dying, but of never getting to live the life we'd started building, never teaching those children, never waking up next to you, never... Her voice broke. Never becoming everything we could be together. Daniel pulled her close, careful of her bruises, and held her while she cried. Not the desperate tears of trauma, but the release of fear and relief mixed together, the emotional aftermath of surviving something that could have destroyed them. When the tears finally subsided, Lillian pulled back and wiped her eyes, attempting a smile. I'm sorry. I told myself I wouldn't fall apart. You're not falling apart. You're healing. There's a difference. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. And you don't have to be strong every moment. Not with me. I know. That's one of the reasons I love you. I don't have to perform or pretend. I can just be. They ate the soup Clara had left, sitting at the small kitchen table, talking about mundane things deliberately. The repairs needed on the school building, The curriculum Lillian wanted to implement, the new cattle Daniel was planning to acquire. Normal life, ordinary concerns, the foundation they would build on once the chaos settled. I received a letter from the school board, Lillian said as they were cleaning up. They want to hold a community meeting next week to officially introduce me as the new teacher. They're suggesting we make it a celebration, a way to mark the beginning of something new for the town. After what happened, do you feel up to that? Honestly, yes. I think it would be good, for me, for the community, for everyone who's been affected by this. Show that we're not letting Calder's actions define us or derail our plans. She set down the dish she was drying. But I'd want you there, standing with me, if that's all right. I wouldn't be anywhere else. She smiled, and Daniel saw something shift in her expression, determination replacing uncertainty. Then let's do it. Let's show this town that we're here to stay, that we're building something that matters, and that no amount of violence or fear can stop us. They spent the evening making plans, talking about the future with increasing confidence. The school would open in September, giving Lillian 3 months to prepare. In that time, Daniel would help her settle in completely, introduce her to every family in the area, ensure she felt integrated into the community. They talked about marriage too, cautiously at first, then with growing certainty. I want to wait until after the trial, Lillian said. I want that chapter completely closed before we start this new one. But after, she looked at him with such love that it made his chest ache. After, I'd very much like to marry you, Daniel Cross. If the offer still stands. The offer will always stand. Today, tomorrow, a year from now. Whenever you're ready, I'll be waiting. You've done enough waiting, in storms and otherwise. She moved closer, rested her head against his shoulder. But a few more weeks won't hurt. We'll have the trial. I'll start settling into my role as teacher, and then we'll have a future without shadows hanging over it. Daniel wrapped his arm around her, marveling at her resilience. She'd been kidnapped hours ago, had faced death and emerged battered but unbroken. And here she was planning for the future with clear-eyed determination. She was extraordinary, and he was the luckiest man alive. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy, punctuated by preparation for the trial. Lillian threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse, enlisting help from parents who were eager to contribute. The building was thoroughly cleaned, desks were repaired, new textbooks were ordered from a supplier in Dallas. Daniel worked alongside her most days, doing the heavy lifting while she organized and planned. The community meeting celebrating her appointment went better than anyone expected. Nearly every family in the area attended, crowding into the church hall with food and good wishes. Lillian spoke about her vision for the school, and parents asked questions with genuine interest rather than suspicion. Children stared at her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, the typical response to a new teacher. You're going to be wonderful, Mrs. Patterson told Lillian as the evening wound down. These children need someone who actually cares about their minds, not just their behavior. You'll make a real difference here. Daniel watched from the side of the room as Lillian interacted with her future students and their families. She was in her element, discussing education with passion and intelligence, connecting with people in a way that was both professional and genuinely warm. This was where she belonged, he realized. Not in some Boston drawing room or San Francisco academy, but here, where what she offered was needed and valued. The trial date arrived with surprising speed. Judge Harrison rode into town with his court clerk and bailiff, setting up in the town hall that would serve as a temporary courthouse. The proceedings drew a crowd. Everyone wanted to see justice done, wanted to witness Roy Calder's downfall. Daniel and Lillian sat in the front row, hands clasped, as Sheriff Morrison presented his case. The evidence was overwhelming. Calder's threatening behavior, the kidnapping, the violence at the mine, witness after witness confirmed the story. Even Calder's hired men, captured in a neighboring town, testified against him in exchange for lighter sentences. Calder himself remained defiant throughout, insisting he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd been trying to rescue Lillian from a life beneath her. His lawyer, a harried public defender who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, made a half-hearted attempt at defense, but had nothing to work with. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. Judge Harrison sentenced him to 15 years in the territorial prison in Huntsville, to be served without possibility of early release. Calder's face went white as the sentence was read, the reality of his situation finally breaking through his delusions. "Take him away," Harrison said with finality, "and may this serve as a reminder to anyone who thinks they can terrorize good people in this territory." As Calder was led from the courtroom in chains, he turned one last time toward Lillian. She met his gaze steadily, her expression not triumphant, but simply resolved. She had survived him. She had won. And now he would fade into her past, a cautionary tale rather than an ongoing threat. Outside the courthouse, people congratulated them, offered support, expressed relief that justice had been served. It felt anticlimactic somehow. All that fear and violence reduced to a legal proceeding and a sentence. But as Daniel and Lillian walked away from the courthouse together, he felt something lift from his shoulders. The shadow was gone. The threat was ended. That evening, they rode out to the ranch together. Clara had made herself scarce, having decided to stay in town with friends, giving them privacy. The sun was setting as they arrived, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple. They stood on the porch, watching the light fade, neither speaking for a long time. Then Lillian turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "It's over," she said softly. "Really, truly over." "Yes. Which means we can begin, really begin, without anything holding us back." She took a deep breath. "Daniel Cross, I love you. I want to build a life with you here. I want to teach those children and watch them grow. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to face whatever challenges come next together, as partners, as equals, as husband and wife," he finished. "Yes. So I'm asking you, will you marry me? Soon, before I lose my nerve or the universe throws another obstacle in our path?" Daniel laughed, the sound surprised out of him by sheer joy. "I thought men were supposed to do the asking. I'm an educated woman from Boston. I don't always follow convention." "No, you don't. That's one of the things I love most about you." He pulled her close, kissed her with all the love and relief and hope he'd been carrying. "Yes, Lillian Moore, I'll marry you. Tomorrow if you want, or next week, or whenever you say. Just say when, and I'll be there." 2 weeks, she decided. That gives us time to arrange something simple but meaningful. Nothing elaborate, just family and close friends. Claire can help me find a dress. We'll have the ceremony here, at the ranch, where we first started building our future together. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. They stayed on the porch long after full dark fell, wrapped in blankets against the cooling air, making plans and dreaming aloud. The stars came out in their thousands, brilliant against the black sky, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang its lonely song to the moon. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in late May, they were married in front of the ranch house with Clara serving as witness and a circuit preacher conducting the simple ceremony. The community turned out despite the short notice, bringing food and well wishes and genuine joy at seeing two people who'd fought so hard for their happiness finally achieve it. Lillian wore a simple white dress that Clara had helped her alter, flowers in her hair that Daniel had picked that morning from the prairie. He wore his best clothes, still rough by Boston standards, but clean and carefully pressed. They spoke their vows with voices that shook slightly but remained strong, promising to honor and cherish and stand by each other through whatever the future brought. When the preacher pronounced them married, Daniel kissed his wife with the kind of tenderness that made several of the watching women cry. Lillian smiled against his lips, her hands cupping his face, and whispered words only he could hear. "I found you. In a blizzard, in a letter, in the middle of nowhere. I found you." "We found each other," he corrected, "and I'm never letting go." The celebration that followed was simple but joyful, food and music and dancing as the sun moved across the sky. Children ran wild, freed from their usual constraints. Adults told stories and laughed and celebrated not just a marriage but the triumph of hope over fear, of choice over circumstance, of love that had been tested and proven true. As evening approached and the guests began to depart, Clara pulled them both aside for a private moment. "I'm so happy for you," she said, her eyes wet with tears. "Danny, you deserve this. Lillian, you're the best thing that ever happened to him, and I'm grateful every day that you were brave enough to get on that train. Thank you, Lillian said, embracing her, for everything, for placing that advertisement, for welcoming me, for standing by us through all of it. That's what family does. And you're family now, truly and completely. After Clara left, after the last guest had departed and the sun had finally set, Daniel and Lillian stood alone in front of the house that was now truly theirs together. The future stretched ahead of them, full of uncertainty and challenge and work, but also full of promise. "Ready to start our life together, Mrs. Cross?" Daniel asked, offering his hand. Lillian took it without hesitation. "I've been ready since the moment I stepped off that train into a blizzard and saw you waiting." They walked inside together, closing the door on the past and opening their hearts to whatever tomorrow would bring. The violence, the fear, the threats, all of it was behind them now. Ahead lay only the life they would build together, one day at a time, with love and determination and the unshakable belief that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The first months of marriage passed in a blur of joy and adjustment. Lillian moved her belongings from the teacher's house to the ranch, merging her life with Daniel's in ways both practical and profound. She hung curtains in the windows, arranged books on shelves Daniel had built specially for her, planted flowers in the yard that Clara said wouldn't survive the Texas heat but thrived anyway, out of sheer determination. The school opened in September as planned, and Lillian threw herself into teaching with the passion Daniel had seen in her letters. She arrived home each evening exhausted but glowing, full of stories about her students' progress, their questions, their small triumphs. 8-year-old Sarah, who'd finally grasped multiplication. 10-year-old James, who'd written his first complete essay. 14-year-old Margaret, who was showing real aptitude for science, and whose parents Lillian was gently persuading to consider higher education. "They're brilliant," Lillian said one evening in October, sitting across from Daniel at dinner. "Every single one of them. They just needed someone to believe they could learn more than basic reading and arithmetic." "You're making a difference," Daniel said, watching her face light up as she spoke. "Exactly like you wanted." "I am, and it feels—" She paused, searching for words. "It feels like I'm finally doing what I was meant to do. Not performing a role, not meeting expectations, but actually making something better." The ranch thrived too. Daniel had bought new cattle with money saved over years of careful management, and the herd was growing strong. He'd hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, young men from town who were eager to learn and willing to put in long hours. It meant Daniel could spend more time at home, could be there when Lillian returned from school, could share meals and evenings and the quiet intimacy of shared life. But it was in November, as autumn turned toward winter, that their life together took on a new dimension. Lillian had been tired for weeks, attributing it to the demands of teaching and adjusting to ranch life. But when the fatigue persisted and morning sickness began, they both knew what it meant. "I'm pregnant," Lillian said one evening, the words a mixture of wonder and fear. "Doc Henderson confirmed it today. Due sometime in June, he thinks." Daniel felt his heart stop and restart, emotions flooding through him too fast to name. Joy, terror, hope, worry, all of it hitting at once. How do you feel about this?" "Scared," she admitted, "but also happy, incredibly happy." She took his hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to be parents, Daniel. We're going to have a family." He pulled her close, holding her carefully as though she might break, though he knew she was far stronger than she looked. "We'll figure it out together. Whatever comes, we'll handle it." "I know. That's what makes it less frightening, knowing I'm not doing this alone." They told Clara the next day, and she burst into tears of happiness, immediately beginning to plan and organize in the way she did when emotions overwhelmed her need for practical action. She'd help with the baby, she declared. She'd teach Lillian everything she knew about caring for infants. She'd make blankets and clothes and everything the child would need. The community responded with similar joy when the news spread. Parents of Lillian's students brought gifts, hand-me-down baby clothes, carved wooden toys, offers of help and advice. It felt like the whole town was invested in this child, this new life that represented hope and continuity and the future they were all building together. Winter came, milder than the blizzard that had marked Daniel and Lillian's first meeting, but still cold enough to keep them close to home in the evenings. Lillian continued teaching through January and February, though Doc Henderson warned her to take it easy. She ignored this advice with her characteristic stubbornness, insisting she felt fine, that staying active was good for both her and the baby. "You're as stubborn as your mother," Daniel would tell her stomach, earning a laugh from Lillian. "This child doesn't stand a chance," she'd reply. "Between your determination and my stubbornness, they're going to be impossible. Or remarkable. Or both." March brought warmer weather and the first signs of spring, green shoots pushing through brown earth, wildflowers beginning to bloom, cattle growing fat on new grass. Lillian's pregnancy was showing now, impossible to hide, and she'd finally conceded to reducing her teaching hours, working mornings only, and spending afternoons resting at home. Daniel found himself watching her constantly, marveling at the changes in her body, the way she carried this new life with such grace. She was beautiful in a way that transcended physical appearance, luminous with purpose, glowing with the knowledge of what she was creating. It was in late March, on an afternoon warm enough to sit on the porch, that Lillian brought up something they'd been dancing around for weeks. "I've been thinking about names," she said, her hand resting on her rounded belly, where the baby had just kicked. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after your father. I know you two had a complicated relationship, but Clara told me about the good times too, before the drinking. I think it would mean something." Daniel felt his throat tighten. His father had died when Daniel was 17, drunk and broken, and a shadow of the man he'd once been. But there had been good years before that, years when Thomas Cross had been a good father, a good man. Naming a child after him felt like redemption somehow, like honoring the best of what he'd been rather than mourning what he'd become. "Thomas," Daniel said softly, "if it's a boy, and if it's a girl, I was thinking Grace for Clara, whose middle name is Grace, and for—" Lillian paused, her eyes distant. "For the grace we've both been given, finding each other, surviving everything that tried to tear us apart, being given this chance to build something beautiful." "Grace or Thomas Cross," Daniel said, testing the names. "I like both of them." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun move lower in the sky, feeling the baby kick and turn inside Lillian's belly. These moments of peace felt precious, stolen from time, little pockets of perfect contentment. But peace, as they'd learned, was always temporary. It was early April when the letter arrived. Daniel was in town picking up supplies when the postmaster called him over, his expression grave. "This came for you," he said, handing over an envelope with official markings. "From the prison in Huntsville." Daniel's blood went cold. He tore open the envelope right there, scanning the contents quickly. The words seemed to blur together at first, then came into sharp focus. Roy Calder had escaped 3 days ago during a prison transfer. He'd overpowered a guard, stolen a horse, and vanished into the territory. Authorities were searching, but so far there was no sign of him. The prison was notifying all parties involved in his case as a precaution. Daniel crumpled the letter in his fist, fighting down panic. Calder was free. Dangerous, unstable, vengeful Calder was somewhere out there, possibly heading toward Abilene, possibly coming for Lillian. He rode home faster than was wise, his mind racing through possibilities and plans. They'd need to be careful, watchful. He'd need to ensure Lillian was never alone, that the ranch was secure, that everyone who cared about them was aware of the danger. When he arrived home, he found Lillian in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly to herself. She looked up when he entered, and her smile faded immediately when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" He told her, watching her face go pale as the implications sank in. To her credit, she didn't fall apart. She simply set down the knife she'd been using, steadied herself against the counter, and took a deep breath. "He's coming here," she said. It wasn't a question. "We don't know that. He could be running in the opposite direction, trying to get as far from Texas as possible. No, he's coming here. Men like him, they can't let go. They can't accept defeat." Her hand moved protectively to her stomach. "He'll want to finish what he started." Daniel moved to her side, wrapped his arms around her carefully. "I won't let him hurt you. I won't let him anywhere near you or our baby." "I know you'll try, but Daniel—" She pulled back to look at him, her eyes fierce. "I'm not going to live in fear again. I won't lock myself away and wait for him to appear. We work too hard for this life to let him take it from us. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we take precautions, but we keep living. I'll keep teaching, with an escort to and from school, if you insist. You'll keep working. We'll be alert and careful, but we won't let the threat of him destroy the life we've built. It was the bravest thing he'd ever heard, and also the most terrifying. But he understood it. They'd already let Calder disrupt their lives once. Giving him that power again, even from a distance, felt like letting him win. They implemented careful safeguards. Daniel arranged for ranch hands to escort Lillian to and from school each day. He spoke with Sheriff Morrison, who increased patrols around town, and promised to notify them immediately if there was any sign of Calder. Clara moved temporarily into the ranch house, providing both company and an extra set of eyes. Days passed with no sign of trouble. Then a week. Then 2. The tension slowly eased as it seemed increasingly likely that Calder had fled the territory entirely, heading somewhere far from the scene of his crimes. April gave way to May, and Lillian's pregnancy advanced into its final weeks. She stopped teaching at the end of April, as Doc Henderson insisted, spending her days at home preparing for the baby's arrival. The room that had been Daniel's office was transformed into a nursery, painted and furnished with loving care. Clara sewed blankets and tiny clothes. Parents of Lillian's students sent gifts and good wishes. 2 more weeks, Doc Henderson said during a checkup in mid-May. Maybe 3 at most. Baby's in the right position, everything looks good. Just take it easy and call for me the moment labor starts. That night, Daniel lay awake beside Lillian, his hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby move. In just days, they'd be parents. Their family would be complete. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd survived, it was all leading to this moment. "I'm scared," Lillian whispered in the darkness. "About the birth? About being a mother? About whether I'll be any good at this? You'll be extraordinary, just like you are at everything else. You don't know that. I do. I've watched you with your students, the patience, the kindness, the way you see potential in everyone. Our child is going to be so loved, so supported, so encouraged to become whoever they're meant to be." He kissed her temple. "You're going to be an amazing mother." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I love you. No matter what happens, no matter what comes next, I want you to know that everything we've built together has been the greatest joy of my life. Mine too. Always." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, the baby moving between them. A family already, even though they hadn't yet met the person who would complete them. Daniel woke to Lillian shaking his shoulder, her voice tight with pain. "It's time. The baby's coming." The next hours passed in a blur of activity and waiting. Clara fetched Doc Henderson while Daniel stayed with Lillian, helping her through contractions that came with increasing frequency and intensity. She was brave through all of it, breathing through the pain, squeezing Daniel's hand hard enough to leave bruises. Doc Henderson arrived with the sun, checked Lillian's progress, and pronounced that things were moving along well. Labor was progressing normally, he said. It would be hours yet, but there was no cause for concern. Those hours were the longest of Daniel's life. He stayed by Lillian's side as she labored, offering water and words of encouragement, feeling helpless in the face of her pain, but determined to be present for every moment. Clara bustled around preparing supplies, boiling water, doing all the practical things while Daniel focused entirely on Lillian. "I can't," Lillian gasped at one point, her face slick with sweat. "Daniel, I can't do this." "Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I know. You can do anything." "It hurts too much. I know, but it won't last forever. Soon you'll be holding our baby, and this will all be worth it." She looked at him with exhausted eyes, managed a weak smile. "You promise?" "I promise." The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows when Doc Henderson finally said the words Daniel had been waiting to hear. "It's time to push, Mrs. Cross. Let's meet this baby." What followed was the most intense, terrifying, beautiful thing Daniel had ever witnessed. Lillian's strength as she pushed despite exhaustion. Doc Henderson's calm efficiency. Clara's steady support. And finally, after what felt like both forever and no time at all, the sound he'd been waiting for. A baby's cry. "It's a boy," Doc Henderson announced, holding up a tiny, red-faced, squalling infant. A healthy baby boy. Daniel felt tears streaming down his face as Doc Henderson cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket. Then the doctor was placing the child in Lillian's arms, and she was looking down at their son with an expression of such pure love that Daniel's heart felt too big for his chest. "Thomas," Lillian whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand. "Hello, Thomas. We've been waiting for you." The baby quieted at her voice, his eyes opening to reveal the deep blue of all newborns. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a thatch of dark hair, and a squashed face that Daniel already knew was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Do you want to hold your son?" Lillian asked, looking up at Daniel with shining eyes. With trembling hands, Daniel took the baby, cradling him carefully, terrified he might break something so small and precious. Thomas looked up at him with those unfocused eyes, and Daniel felt his world shift and resettle around this tiny person who'd just entered it. "Hey there," he said softly. "I'm your father, and I promise you, I'll do everything I can to keep you safe, to help you grow, to give you a life worth living." Clara was crying openly now, taking her turn to hold her nephew while Lillian rested. Doc Henderson finished his work, pronounced mother and baby both healthy, and left instructions for the coming days. Friends and neighbors would visit in the following weeks, he said, but for now, the new family should rest and bond and adjust to their new reality. That evening, as the sun set and the ranch settled into quiet, Daniel sat beside the bed where Lillian was nursing Thomas for the first time. The baby latched on with surprising efficiency, and Lillian laughed at the intensity of his hunger. "He's going to be as determined as his mother," Daniel observed, "and as stubborn as his father. Heaven help us all." They sat in peaceful silence, watching their son, marveling at the miracle of him. All the fear and violence and struggle that had marked their journey together, it had led to this moment, this perfect peace, this tiny life that represented hope and continuity and love made manifest. "I never imagined this," Lillian said softly. "A year and a half ago, I was in Boston wondering if my life would ever be more than polite conversations and empty routines. And now," she looked around the room, at Daniel, at their son. "Now I have everything I didn't know I needed." "We both do." Clara knocked softly before entering, her face apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Daniel, Sheriff Morrison is here. Says it's urgent." Daniel's stomach dropped. He looked at Lillian, saw the fear flash across her face before she controlled it. "Go," she said quietly. "Find out what's happening. Clara will stay with me." Daniel found Sheriff Morrison on the porch, his expression grim in the fading light. "He's here," Morrison said without preamble. "Calder. One of my deputies spotted him in town an hour ago. He was asking questions about you and your wife, about the ranch. When the deputy tried to approach him, he ran." "Where is he now?" "We don't know, but Daniel—" Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's armed, and he looked half wild. I don't think he's running anymore. I think he came here for a reason." As if summoned by those words, a shout came from near the barn. Daniel and Morrison both turned to see one of the ranch hands running toward them, his face panicked. "Mr. Cross, there's a man. He's got a gun. Says he wants to talk to Mrs. Cross." Daniel was moving before the words finished, his gun drawn, Morrison right behind him. They rounded the corner of the house to find Roy Calder standing in the yard, illuminated by lamplight from the windows. He looked terrible, gaunt, dirty, his clothes torn and his eyes fevered with desperation and madness. And he was pointing a gun directly at the house where Lillian and Thomas slept. "That's far enough," Calder said, his voice hoarse. "Both of you, stay right there." "Put the gun down, Calder," Morrison ordered. "You're already facing prison. Don't make this worse." "Worse?" Calder laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "How could it be worse? Everything I had, everything I could have been, she took it all. The beautiful school teacher who was supposed to be mine, who was supposed to—" His voice cracked. "I came to save her, and she chose him, chose this. And now what does she have? A baby? A life? While I rot in a cell?" "She never belonged to you," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady, despite the rage burning in his chest. She made her choice, and you need to accept that. No. Calder's gun hand steadied, his finger moving to the trigger. If I can't have her, if I can't have the life I deserved, then why should she get everything? Why should she be happy while I suffer? Daniel saw the moment Calder decided to shoot, saw his finger tighten, saw the gun begin to lift toward the window where Lillian was. And without thinking, without hesitation, Daniel fired. The shot cracked through the evening air, echoing off the house and barn. Calder stumbled backward, his gun falling from his hand, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, then back up at Daniel with an expression of almost comical surprise. "You shot me," he said, as though he couldn't quite believe it. "You were going to shoot my wife," Daniel replied, his voice empty of emotion. "I couldn't let that happen." Calder collapsed to his knees, then fell forward into the dirt. Morrison rushed forward, checking for a pulse, then looked up at Daniel and shook his head. "He's gone." Daniel lowered his gun, his hands suddenly shaking with the realization of what he'd done. He'd killed a man, not in the heat of combat, not in a moment of blind rage, but with cold, clear purpose. To protect his family, to end a threat that would never stop. Morrison was speaking, something about self-defense and justification and how this was clearly a righteous shooting, but Daniel barely heard him. He was staring at Calder's body, at the final end of a threat that had haunted them for so long. "Daniel?" Lillian's voice came from the porch, and he turned to find her standing there, Clara beside her supporting her arm. Is he?" "It's over," Daniel said, moving toward her. "It's really over this time." She sagged against him, whether from relief or exhaustion or both he couldn't tell. Clara took Thomas, who'd slept through everything, and Daniel held his wife, feeling her heart beating against his chest, grateful beyond words that she was safe, that their son was safe, that this nightmare was finally, truly finished. The aftermath took hours. Morrison's deputies came to collect the body and take statements. The shooting was ruled justified, self-defense and protection of family, clear and unambiguous. Calder would be buried in an unmarked grave in the town cemetery, his story ending as violently as he'd lived it. By the time everyone left and the ranch was quiet again, it was well past midnight. Daniel sat in the nursery, watching Thomas sleep in his cradle, trying to process everything that had happened in the past day. Birth and death, beginning and ending, all compressed into a handful of hours. Lillian appeared in the doorway, moving slowly, still recovering from childbirth. "You should be resting," Daniel said. "So should you. But here we both are." She crossed to him, sat carefully in the chair beside his. "Are you all right?" "I killed a man." "You saved your family. There's a difference." "Is there?" "I pointed a gun at another human being and pulled the trigger. I ended his life." Lillian was quiet for a moment, her hand finding his. "Do you regret it?" Daniel thought about that question honestly. Did he regret killing Calder? No. Given the same circumstances, he'd make the same choice every time. Calder had been about to shoot into their house, where Lillian and their newborn son lay vulnerable. There had been no other option. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it. But I think I'll carry it anyway. The knowledge of what I'm capable of when the people I love are threatened. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You're a good man, Daniel Cross. You've proven that in 100 different ways. This doesn't change that." They sat together in the darkness, listening to their son's soft breathing, letting the knowledge of safety settle into their bones. The threat was gone. The danger had passed. They could finally, truly, begin their life without shadows. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment and healing. Thomas proved to be a relatively easy baby, sleeping in reasonable stretches and nursing well. Lillian recovered from childbirth with her characteristic resilience, though she was more tired than she'd admit. The community rallied around them, bringing meals and help and the kind of support that made Daniel grateful every day that they'd chosen to build their life here. Clara was in her element as an aunt, constantly holding Thomas, singing to him, declaring him the most brilliant baby who'd ever existed. "He smiled at me," she'd announce. "Did you see? He definitely smiled." "He's 3 weeks old," Daniel would say. "That was gas." It was a smile. He recognized his favorite aunt. Summer arrived in full force, turning the prairie gold and bringing long days of heat and work. Daniel hired additional help so he could spend more time at home, wanting to be present for every moment of Thomas's early days. He'd watch Lillian nurse their son and feel his heart swell with gratitude and wonder. He'd hold Thomas and feel the weight of responsibility and love in equal measure. Lillian talked about returning to teaching in the fall, though she admitted she was torn about leaving Thomas. "Maybe I'll start with just mornings," she said one evening in July. "Clara can watch him here, and I'll come home for lunch. The school board would probably accept a half-time schedule." "They'd accept whatever schedule you propose," Daniel said. "You've proven yourself invaluable. They're not going to risk losing you." "I just don't want to miss anything. His first words, his first steps, I want to be here for all of it." "You will be. And even if you're not physically present for every moment, you'll be the best mother he could ask for. Just like you're the best teacher those kids could have." As summer faded into autumn, they settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable, balanced. Lillian returned to teaching 3 mornings a week, Clara watched Thomas with devoted attention, and Daniel managed the ranch with increasing success. The herd was thriving, the land was productive, and the life they'd fought so hard to build was flourishing. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, exactly 18 months after Lillian had stepped off the train into a blizzard, when they found themselves back at the train depot. They'd come to pick up a shipment of new textbooks Lillian had ordered, but as they stood on the platform with Thomas in Lillian's arms, they both stopped and looked at each other with the same realization. "This is where it started," Lillian said softly. "Where you waited in the storm. Where you arrived and changed my entire life." The platform looked different now. No snow, no ice, just autumn sunshine and the normal bustle of a working depot. But Daniel could still see it as it had been that day, could still remember the fear and hope he'd felt waiting for a woman he'd never met. "If someone had told me then what the next 18 months would bring," Lillian said, "I'm not sure I would have believed them. The violence, the danger, the joy, all of it." "Would you have gotten off the train anyway, if you'd known?" She looked up at him, her blue eyes clear and certain. "Every time. I'd choose this life, this place, you. I'd choose it all, every time, no matter what came with it." Thomas made a happy gurgling sound, reaching for Daniel's face with chubby hands. Daniel took him, lifted him up, felt the solid weight of his son in his arms. "Your mother stepped off a train on this platform," he told Thomas, "and changed the world. At least, she changed mine." "We changed each other's," Lillian corrected, sliding her arm around Daniel's waist. "That's what love does. It transforms both people, makes them more than they were alone." They stood there on the platform as the afternoon light turned golden, a family complete and whole, built on a foundation of letters and promises kept and choices made in the face of fear. Around them, life continued its normal rhythm, trains arriving and departing, people greeting and parting, the endless cycle of arrivals and departures that marked the passage of time. But for Daniel and Lillian Cross, time felt suspended in this moment. They'd come full circle, back to where it began, but so changed, so transformed by everything they'd experienced together. "Come on," Daniel said finally, shifting Thomas to one arm and taking Lillian's hand with the other. "Let's go home." They walked back to their wagon together, loaded the textbooks, and began the familiar ride back to the ranch. The prairie stretched around them in all directions, vast and beautiful under the October sky. Thomas dozed against Daniel's chest, lulled by the wagon's gentle rocking. Lillian sat close beside him, her head occasionally resting on his shoulder. "I'm happy," she said suddenly. "Right now, in this moment, I'm completely, perfectly happy." "So am I." "Do you think it will last? This happiness?" Daniel thought about that question carefully. They'd been through so much, violence and fear and threats that had tested them to their limits. Life would bring more challenges, more struggles. The ranch would have hard years alongside good ones. Thomas would grow and bring his own complications. Nothing stayed perfect forever. "No," he said honestly, "not like this, not unchanged, but I think we'll build new happiness, different kinds of joy. We'll face problems and solve them. We'll struggle and survive. And through all of it, we'll have each other. That's what matters. Not whether every moment is perfect, but whether we're facing those moments together. That's very wise. I have my moments, she laughed, the sound mixing with the creak of the wagon wheels and the whisper of wind through grass. By the time they reached home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in those impossible shades of orange and purple that only seemed to exist in Texas. Clara met them at the door, took Thomas so they could unload the textbooks, and disappeared inside with the baby. Daniel and Lillian worked together to carry in the heavy boxes, stacking them in what had become Lillian's study, a room where she prepared lessons and graded papers and continued to be the teacher she'd always wanted to be. That night, after Thomas was asleep and the house was quiet, Daniel and Lillian sat on their porch as they so often did. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air was cool but not cold, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. "Thank you," Lillian said suddenly. "For what?" "For waiting in the storm, for being exactly who you said you were in your letters, for building this life with me, for protecting it, for," her voice caught, "for loving me enough to give me the space to choose it freely." "I should be thanking you," Daniel said, "for being brave enough to get on that train, for seeing past the rough exterior to whatever you found worth loving, for giving me Thomas, this life, everything I didn't know I needed." They sat in silence for a while, hands joined, both aware of how precious these quiet moments were. In the house behind them, their son slept peacefully. Around them, the ranch they'd built together spread out in all directions. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent witnesses to human drama and joy. Decades would pass. Thomas would grow strong and bright, eventually taking over the ranch and expanding it beyond what Daniel had imagined possible. More children would come. 2 daughters, Grace and Sarah, both of whom would inherit their mother's fierce intelligence and their father's steadfast determination. The school Lillian built would become renowned throughout the territory, producing students who went on to become teachers, lawyers, doctors, leaders in their communities. Daniel and Lillian would grow old together, their love deepening rather than fading, tested again and again by life's challenges, but never broken. They would sit on this same porch decades later, their hair gray and their bodies slower, and remember the young people they'd been when they first met on a frozen train platform. But that was the future, unknowable and unwritten. Tonight, they were young and strong and building something that would last far beyond their own lives. Tonight, they had everything they needed, each other, their son, the land beneath their feet, and the sky above their heads. "I wouldn't miss you," Daniel said quietly, repeating the words he'd spoken that first night, words that had come out wrong but had meant everything. Lillian squeezed his hand, understanding as she always did. "I know, and I wouldn't miss this, not for anything in the world." They sat together as the night deepened, 2 people who had found each other across distance and danger and doubt, who had chosen each other again and again, who had built something real and lasting and true. The blizzard that had marked their beginning was long gone, melted away by time and warmth and the heat of a love that proved stronger than any storm. But the promise made in that blizzard remained, unbroken, unchanged, kept every day through actions rather than words. A promise to show up, to be present, to choose each other despite fear and uncertainty and all the reasons they might have walked away. The train had arrived in a blizzard. The cowboy had been waiting. And from that moment of kept promise, they had built a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. This was their story, not a fairy tale where everything was easy, but something better. A true story of real people who had faced real darkness and chosen light anyway, who had been broken by violence and rebuilt themselves through love, who had taken risks and survived them and emerged stronger on the other side. And every day, for the rest of their lives, they would look at each other and remember that first moment on the platform, when a man kept his promise and a woman took a leap of faith and 2 strangers began the long journey of becoming family. The stars continued their ancient dance overhead, indifferent but beautiful. The prairie slept around them, vast and patient. And on the porch of a ranch in Texas, 2 people sat together in perfect peace, knowing they had found what so many spend lifetimes searching for. They had found each other. They had found home. And that was enough. It would always be enough.